cloud of mist moved through the darkness. It moved through tiny openings, skirting past metallic pipes and walls. "You getting excited?" said the voice of a man from below the cloud of mist. "I don't know," answered a female voice. "I'm more nervous than excited." "Why?" the man asked with a hearty laugh. "Because none of you ever told me what this is even about," the woman answered in annoyance. "Whenever I ask about this surprise, you guys are always vague and laugh. That makes me nervous, okay?" "Oh, come on," the guy answered. "All employees go through this ritual. We were all nervous before it happened, but after that, we were happy that it was a surprise." "Why?" the woman asked. "Because hearing about it is not nearly as good as experiencing it," the man answered cryptically. "Okay," the woman answered after some uncomfortable seconds. "That's true for a surprise party as well, but I don't think people would still insist on keeping this a secret when the recipient feels so nervous about this entire thing." "It's gonna be fine," the guy answered with a roll of his eyes. "We're nearly there, you'll see. You'll thank me that we left this as a surprise." The cloud of mist saw the two extractors walking through a door, which led to a staircase. A moment later, lights turned on, and the two of them stopped in front of a door. "Knock, knock, knock." The man knocked on the door and waited. "Where does this door lead to? I've never been here," the woman asked, looking around. "Storage," the man answered. "Why would we?" Then the door opened, revealing another woman. "Chief," the woman exclaimed in surprise, "why are you here?" The new woman smiled. "Why for you, of course," she answered. I didn't know that this surprise involved you, Chief," the woman answered. "See," the man added with a smug laugh from the side. "Isn't it worth the surprise?" "Come in," the chief said with a nod as she stepped to the side. The man and the woman passed through the door, and the chief closed it behind them. The woman found herself in a big storage area with all kinds of things. While she was looking around, the chief walked to the back of the storage area, past some old and unused containment units. The other two followed. Eventually, the chief walked into one of the deactivated containment units. "What are we doing here?" the woman asked in a whisper to the guy. "This is our most sacred place," the guy said. "This is where we will hold your initiation." "In here?" the woman asked. "I thought we would be holding that in a hall or an office, not in some random storage room." "Pearly," the guy answered, "not everything is as it appears on the surface. All manufacturers have their secrets and we are no different. Just come with us, okay?" When Pearly heard that, she became nervous again. That was a bit too forceful for her liking. "And that's why I never made you a team lead," the chief commented with annoyance. "You're not good at dealing with people during stressful situations." "Yes, Chief, I'm sorry, Chief," the man quickly replied. "Chief?" Pearly asked. "Yes," the chief answered as she stopped in the middle of the containment unit, looking back. "Why are we doing my initiation here?" Pearly asked. The chief bent down and put her hand on the ground. Bang! The next moment she pushed onto the ground and a big plate detached. Ding! The plate fell for about 50 centimeters before it landed on something. Pearly's eyebrows rose in surprise. "A secret passage." "Because," the chief answered as she pushed the metallic plate to the side, "as a fully fledged member of Vandalize, you have to know our true face." Bang! The chief kicked the ground again, detaching another metallic plate. This time it fell for nearly 3 meters. The chief looked into the dark hole and retrieved something from her pocket. It was a white crystal with some kind of malleable clay on the bottom. She attached the crystal to the ceiling below the hole, and moments later, it started to shine with bright light. Now Pearly could finally see what was beneath her. It was a small cave. "After your initiation," the chief said, pointing at the light crystal, "you won't need this anymore." "Huh," Pearly uttered. "Wait, I'm also receiving my very own veil of darkness." The chief nodded with a smile. "Yes, as a fully fledged member, you also get access to the very thing that makes us outstanding in Wild City." Pearly looked excited, but she was also nervous. The veil of darkness. The technology that gave the most powerful extractors of Vandalize the ability to travel through the darkness without using a lot of resources. The ability to walk through darkness unhindered was one of the most useful abilities one could imagine, and Vandalize was at the forefront of traveling in darkness. Naturally, Vandalize was secretive about their veil of darkness, and nobody knew how it worked. The chief and the man jumped down and landed in the cave. A moment later, Pearly also jumped down. When she landed, she came face to face with an open door. Pearly's eyes widened as soon as she saw it. This was not just any door. This was the big door of a containment unit. The door that was used to put Specters into containment units. A containment unit with an opened big door might as well just be a room. What are we? Pearlie wanted to say something, but she was interrupted as a bright light exploded from the middle of the opened containment unit, blinding her. In panic, she turned to her chief and only saw a calm and happy smile on her face. Pearlie quickly looked back at the ball of light. And then 6 white wings extended from the ball of light. "Child," a warm voice spoke. Ding! Pearlie's barrier activated and turned red, and several warning signs covered her vision. Pearlie immediately knew what all of this meant. A powerful Specter with a mental ability. "Don't be afraid, child," the winged ball of light proclaimed as it slowly flew closer to Pearlie. Pearlie looked at her chief in horror before turning to the man. Then both of them fell to their knees in prayer. Pearlie didn't want to believe it, but there could only be a single explanation for this. Her chief and the man were minions of this Specter. Bang! Pearlie turned around and charged for the exit. Boom! The ear-shattering sound of a bullet being fired reverberated throughout the underground. 2 holes were in Pearlie's barrier. The chief put her gun away again. Pearlie felt all her Zephyx leave her, and she felt like she couldn't breathe anymore. Her Zephosis was interrupted. Pearlie collapsed the next moment. "Every time," the chief said with a sigh. "Why do they always resist the gift of the Lord?" The man stood up and approached Pearlie. The next moment, he retrieved a vial with green liquid and dumped it onto her. Pearlie's Zephosis restarted, but she was still dangerously low on Zephyx. "Come on," the man said in a calm voice as he pulled Pearlie up by the arm. "Properly greet the Lord." "Do not be afraid, child," the ball spoke. "You will be part of our family soon." "Power, light, and virtue. This is what makes us vandalize," the ball spoke. Pearlie tried to think of any way to escape. She didn't want to become a minion. But the more she looked into the light, the more welcoming it seemed. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. After all, the chief seemed quite happy. The ball of light stopped right in front of Pearlie, and the next second it enveloped her with its wings. Pearlie felt warm. She felt nice. It was so soft. She felt loved. It was okay. Everything would be okay. After a while, she opened her eyes again, and when she looked at the winged ball, she only felt love and loyalty. This was the Lord. This was the destined one. He would transform the world into a paradise. But then, Pearlie screamed in pain. The light that had been flowing into Pearlie was now coming out of her. Even more, far more light was leaving her than had entered. After some seconds, Pearlie collapsed, and when there was no more light to be extracted, she just looked at the ground in a neutral expression. "You are part of our family now," the ball spoke. Pearlie looked up at it. She didn't feel anything. No happiness. No anger. No sadness. No fear. No safety. She felt nothing. Well, except for one thing. She felt longing. Longing to feel this warm embrace again. The warm embrace from just now had been the most beautiful thing she had ever experienced, and compared to the grayness around her right now, it was infinitely better. She longed for the warm embrace. This was the only desire inside her. Chapter 585, 8 Years. The cloud of mist floated out of a high tower and vanished an instant later. The high tower was painted in red and black, and the word vandalize was painted across its front. This was the 3rd biggest manufacturer of Markwild City, led by 3 people, the most powerful being the chief Zephyx Extractor, a peak expert. Vandalize's tower was big, towering over almost every other building in its surroundings. However, there were still 2 buildings that were even taller, but they were over 2 kilometers away. In fact, one of them was so big that it counted as a megastructure with a height of over a kilometer and a width of almost 300 meters. This megastructure housed the government and the biggest manufacturer of the city. In many cities, the biggest manufacturers worked together with the government in a symbiotic relationship. This was not really how Aegis envisioned its cities to be run, but it was a sad reality that over 30% of cities were run like this. Inside the megastructure, in a random room 75% of the way up the building, 4 people sat in different locations, doing different things. This was Shirley's squad. The red-haired mender lay on the couch, acting like he was sleeping, which he definitely wasn't. Cynthia sat on a chair in front of the desk, talking animatedly with Shirley, who sat opposite her. Surprisingly, the two of them laughed quite a bit as they talked. Near the kitchen, Steve drew several lines on a sheet of paper. All the sheets of paper were covered with the blueprints of Vandalize's tower. "You got an idea yet?" Cynthia shouted to Steve. "No," Steve answered, not looking up. "Then what are you still doing there? If you didn't get one by now, what makes you think you will get one in the future?" Cynthia asked casually. Steve frowned. "I have to be prepared," he answered without looking away from the plans. "Steve, we need to wait for Nick," Cynthia said with a sigh. "You can look through the plans all day, but as long as we don't know where the Specter is, you won't get anywhere. Also, we don't even know if the requester is actually right. This might just be another one of these attempts to get rid of an upstart manufacturer." Sadly, Cynthia's attempt at calming Steve down didn't achieve anything. He didn't want to show his true feelings in front of his team, but he failed. The squad had been working together for around 8 years now, and everyone already knew everyone else. Mender and Cynthia could see that Steve was incredibly nervous. However, they couldn't fault him. "You've been lucky so far," Shirley spoke calmly as she turned to look at Steve's back, "but you can't keep being lucky forever." Steve took a deep breath. "I know," he answered. The atmosphere seemingly became heavier. Mender lightly opened his eyes, but he didn't look around. There was a rare look of worry in his eyes. In fact, everyone in here was worried. Even Shirley. Just a week ago, they had received a mission marked as genuine. The strongest manufacturer of Wild City was the Requester, and they requested an investigation with the eventual eradication of Vandalize. The Requester suspected that Vandalize was harboring an illegal Specter that proved to be a danger to the entire city. Naturally, the government had already done many sweeps and tests, but they never found anything. After many of these sweeps, the smaller manufacturers, led by the second biggest manufacturer, banded together because of the obvious favoritism the government was giving the biggest manufacturer. All these pointless sweeps and inspections were obviously just there to intimidate, vandalize, and interrupt their work. Because of that, the government had to become careful. Sure, the government and the biggest manufacturer were stronger than everything else in the city, but if an actual civil war broke out, the city wouldn't be able to pay its tribute to Aegis. That was the last thing the governor wanted, since that would ruin their chances of ever becoming an agent. Additionally, they had already issued so many inspections and sweeps on Vandalize that the governor might even be in danger of being judged as corrupt by Aegis. But they weren't corrupt. They were sure that Vandalize was hiding some kind of dangerous Specter. The signs were there, but would anyone believe them? In the end, the biggest manufacturer decided to call Aegis. Naturally, the governor became terrified, but it was already too late. Shirley's squad arrived just hours later. Cynthia sighed. She was just as nervous as everyone else. The squad had worked together for 8 years by now, and they had not lost a single person, which was rare. However, that was not the thing she was worried about. In the past 8 years, they had also not needed to kill a human. Criminals rarely came into contact with the squad, since those were handled by the local governments. They had only apprehended 4 criminals within the last 8 years. 3 of them were handed over to the government, and 1 had been taken care of by Nick in secret. The team had had many practice fights with Extractors from other squads. They had also had many genuine fights with Specters. However, they had never been in a genuine life-and-death battle with humans. That also included their time before Aegis. Cynthia, Mender, and Steve were all progenies from households of extreme elites. They had incredible education, perfect training, and streamlined careers. They had rarely been involved with anything illegal, and they had never joined any really dangerous battles. After all, they were the ticket for their families to finally get a foothold in Aegis. Their families wouldn't risk their lives that easily. Sadly, that meant they had never genuinely fought another Extractor. Almost nobody looked forward to killing another human for the first time, and those who did almost certainly wouldn't find themselves working for Aegis. They knew they had to kill humans sometimes, but after working for Aegis for so long, they had also internalized Aegis ideology. Logically, they could rationalize killing humans, but emotionally, there was a huge barrier. They really hoped this was just another case of somebody trying to use Aegis to get rid of a rival. The squad had come into contact with something like that more than once over the years. Suddenly, the door opened, and everyone looked over. Nick entered the room with a neutral expression. The expressions of his squad members were nervous and attentive, while Shirley looked at him with furrowed brows. Naturally, Shirley had killed many humans before. She wasn't as inexperienced as the other three. However, after such a long time with the squad, she also had mixed feelings. On the one hand, it was important for trainees to learn about killing humans, but on the other, she really didn't want to see her squad go through such a harrowing experience. Well, except Shirley looked at Nick. She still didn't know a lot about Nick's background since he kept all details secret, but she could tell that he must have doomed more than his fair share of people to have created a powerful manufacturer out of nothing. The opposition must have been powerful, and yet Nick's manufacturer still prevailed until he was an expert. Nick had to have a lot of experience when it came to killing people. Shirley glanced at the other three. But he was different from those three. "What's the status, Nick?" Steve asked after taking a deep breath and turning around. Nick emotionlessly looked at him. There is an unsuppressed fanatic in their basement. The entire upper echelon of Vandalize is made of its minions. I witnessed how a peak veteran was turned into a minion with my own eyes, Nick neutrally reported. The atmosphere seemingly froze. Nick had confirmed their worst fears. The governor had been right. Vandalize was completely compromised. Mender closed his eyes again as he took a deep breath. Cynthia furrowed her brows and looked to the ground. Steve slowly stood up and walked to the middle of the room. "Could you have saved the new minion?" Steve asked calmly. "No, because that would go against your orders," Nick answered. Steve clenched his fists. Steve was the leader of this squad. After many missions, everyone agreed that Steve should be the leader. Cynthia couldn't handle the responsibility, and Mender wasn't interested in leading the team. That left Steve and Nick. In the beginning, Nick led the team, but as more time passed, he gave Steve more and more responsibility. The main reason was that they were trainees and were supposed to learn things. Despite Steve's initial problems, he actually had a fitting personality for being a leader. Additionally, leading a squad while infiltrating enemy lines was not the best option. As the scout, Nick was the furthest one from his team, making it difficult to adequately command them. When Steve heard that Nick couldn't have saved the veteran due to orders, his emotions wanted to explode on Nick. However, Steve had learned to control himself and to logically analyze a situation, even while furious. Nick was right. Steve had given him the order to scout and report back. This was on him. Additionally, would I be happy if he attacked the enemy? Steve thought. No, I would have called him reckless. Nick did the right thing. Steve took a shaky breath. His orders were the reason a human died. But his orders had also been correct. Sadly, that didn't help with the pain. Good work, Steve said. Chapter 586, Leader's Responsibility. Do you want a coffee? Oh, yeah, right, sorry, forgot, Steve said awkwardly as he sat down on the railing again. As always, the sun shone brightly in the sky, even though it was 2 a.m. Steve sat on top of a railing on the top of the megastructure in Mark Wild City. Over the last couple of hours, they had gone through many plans. What plans? Well, plans to eradicate Vandalize. Nick walked closer to Steve, who had just pulled back his cup of coffee. It wasn't difficult for Nick to see how nervous and insecure Steve was at this moment. Usually, Steve always showed a strong front, but when it was just him and Nick, that front often cracked. That was because Nick was Steve's idol. When Steve had worked under Nick, he had been surprised at how insanely good Nick was at leading the team. His calls were always correct. His missions were always clean successes. They had not lost a single member. Even more, Nick always seemed to know exactly what to do and what to say. He had never threatened anyone, and he had never raised his voice. And yet, everyone had followed him without complaints. When Steve had seen how Nick was as a leader, he had felt hopeless. He felt like he had tried to kill the sun. How could he even attempt to lead a team if the leaders were supposed to be this good? He wasn't that good. Steve had given up trying to become a leader back then. However, that was what allowed him to talk to Nick without any feeling of competition. Steve could be honest. Over the years, Steve had learned from Nick. The two of them had regular talks, and Steve basically used Nick as a release for all his insecurities and doubts. And the only thing Nick did in return was give curt answers that made Steve fall into deep thoughts until he finally saw his own inadequacies. When Steve became the leader again, He felt extremely insecure. Yet the missions all went pretty smoothly. Sure, not everything was perfect, but it was good enough. Until, eventually, he even saw himself as the leader of the squad. At that point, his conversations with Nick became less and less frequent. But today, Steve was in a nostalgic mood. He remembered how it was 7 or 8 years ago. Things were so much simpler back then. In the end, he called Nick to talk again. Naturally, Nick approached Steve and stopped beside him. Yet he didn't say anything. He just looked at the distant tower of Vandalize. Silence. Could you have saved her? Steve asked suddenly in a calm voice. Does it matter? Nick asked back in an even voice. It does to me, Steve answered quietly. Have you made a mistake with your orders? Nick asked. Silence. No, Steve answered. Then don't ask such questions, Nick answered. Steve didn't answer. These kinds of questions lead to regret, Nick said. Steve just listened. What if, could I have, should I have? There's a time for these questions, and that's when you suspect that you made a wrong call, Nick explained. But you didn't. Your call was correct, we both know that. In that case, asking these questions will bring nothing but misery to you. When you are sure you made the right call, but you're still in pain, the only thing you can do is to deal with the pain. Steve looked at the city in silence. That sucked. Steve had acted correctly, but he still felt regret and pain over his decision. There was nothing he could have done better. This was already the best-case scenario. And yet it still felt so bad. However, Steve knew that this was what it meant to be a leader. Normal employees did not have the luxury of deciding the direction of the entire unit, but in exchange, they also weren't responsible for the unit's decisions. The leader was responsible. If the unit accomplished a mission perfectly, the leader would be praised. If the unit failed a mission, the leader would be reprimanded. If the plan was perfect but the mission failed, the leader would be reprimanded. If the plan was horrible but the mission succeeded, the leader would be praised. If one employee saved the mission, the leader would be praised. If one employee ruined the mission, the leader would be reprimanded. Everything was on the leader's shoulders. Was it fair? Not entirely. After all, why should the leader be reprimanded because of the failings of a single employee? Sadly, the existence of said employee in the leader's squad falls under the leader's responsibilities. The leader was supposed to only hire good people and deal with bad people. But that wasn't so easy. Sometimes, bad people were extremely good at disguising themselves as good people. If by all appearances the person was good, wouldn't it be an incorrect decision to refuse them? Unfortunately, leaders were evaluated on their successes and failures as a unit, not as individuals. Do you think the plan is bad? Steve asked after several seconds of silence. Based on all available information, the plan is about as good as it can get, Nick answered. Why the qualifier? Steve asked. Because a plan can only be as good as the available information, Nick answered. Most of the time, there are even better plans, but they require even better information. Steve looked at Nick with uncertainty. Could you contribute more than you are already contributing? Steve asked. Can you? Nick asked back. Steve wasn't entirely sure. I genuinely don't know, he said after a bit. You shouldn't, Nick said, even if you can. Why not? Steve asked in surprise. Because we are trainees, Nick explained. Our first priority is learning and gaining experience, not fulfilling missions. Going all in on a chance of success might give us plenty of rewards, but our worth in Aegis' eyes is higher than what it would gain after 100 risky missions from us. We are being seen as future agents. We are supposed to protect entire cities. Maximize the experiences you gain while minimizing the risks you take. Do not include profits earned or missions accomplished, Nick said. Steve had heard that before. Shirley had said something very similar to him in the past. Sadly, Steve still didn't like it very much. Sure, they were here to learn, but many people suffered so that they could learn. They were essentially building heroes on the foundation of innocent corpses. But then, what else were they supposed to do? Not give any agent any real experience before handing them responsibility over entire cities. That would be so much worse. Steve didn't like it, but just like before, this was already the best-case scenario. Everything was muddy. There were no black and white decisions. They were all just different iterations of gray, and it was basically impossible to completely banish black's influence from the result. Is that how you have acted within the last 8 years? Steve asked. Nick wordlessly nodded. Steve thought back to all the times he had told Nick to infiltrate enemy lines. Have you risked your life? Nick just shook his head. This surprised Steve. He had asked Nick to do quite some risky things in the past, but Nick said he hadn't risked his life yet. What was that supposed to mean? Naturally, Steve had suspected many times over the years that Nick was far more powerful than everyone thought. So Steve had given him several risky missions, and even gave Nick the opportunity to decline them. Yet Nick just completed them without any fanfare or complaints. But even then, Nick said he hadn't risked his life yet. That was when Steve remembered that Nick had dodged the question earlier about whether or not he could contribute more. Then Steve remembered that Nick had said the plan was as good as it could get for the available information. By now, Steve was certain that Nick could do much more. Nick, Steve slowly said. Nick didn't answer. Could you deal with the Specter on your own? He asked carefully. The conversation is over, Nick said neutrally before turning around and walking back inside. Steve gritted his teeth and clenched his fists. Sorry, it's fine, Steve said as Nick opened the door to leave. Forget that I asked. However, Nick just entered the building and closed the door behind him. This always happened whenever Steve asked Nick about anything specific related to his past or his person. Mender often joked that Steve and Nick were the best of friends, since they talked so often in secret. Yet Steve always felt like that wasn't accurate. In fact, he didn't know much more than everyone else. They talked so many times, and Steve had learned so much about himself. And yet he had learned nothing about Nick. Nick was like a distant image. Steve had seen this image countless times, but he had never managed to get any closer to learn more about it. There was a wall between them, and no matter what Steve did, it was impossible to get past it. Steve wished that they could be friends, but that wish would never come true. And he knew that. Chapter 587, Mission Start. Bang, bang, bang. A man was punching a huge cube made of powerful material treated with Zephyx. Whenever he unleashed a punch, the entire room shook. The man wasn't wearing any clothing while punching the cube, and he was already sweating profusely. After several minutes of doing this, he stopped and grabbed a towel to get rid of his sweat. He looked at the cube for a while. One day, he would be powerful enough to break it. Theoretically, it was possible for him to break the cube, but he needed to build a bit more muscle. And even then, he would need to punch and kick it for several months to properly damage it. The next moment, the man looked at the clock at the edge of the room. It was time to go to work. The man walked to the exit. But then, he noticed that the wall in front of him started to distort. It was like the wall was growing. Or was he shrinking? Dunk. And then it stopped distorting. The man tried to move, but he couldn't. That was when he noticed that his mind became weaker. When he saw a headless body falling to the ground, he finally understood what had happened. So that was it, huh? This was the end. He wasn't sure what he should think. And nothing. It was over. No more thoughts. Nick bent down and stashed the head and body into a trash bag, which he then threw into his space bag. Nick looked into his space bag and counted the trash bags again to confirm their number. Yep, it's 3. The elite exploration squad is complete, he thought. The elite exploration squad of Vandalize was responsible for capturing the strongest Specters, so that Vandalize could grow more powerful. Vandalize had a total of 7 experts, and the elite exploration squad accounted for 3 of those. The leader of the elite exploration squad, the newest trash bag inside Nick's space bag, was the only late expert of Vandalize. The other 2 members were early experts. That leaves the CZA and the 3 team leads. Nick turned into a cloud of mist again and vanished from the isolated room. Some seconds later, he materialized on top of a small building. Elite Exploration Squad eliminated, Nick spoke into his barrier. The other 3 members of the squad heard Nick, and they became more nervous. There was no way back anymore. Steve felt the pressure on his shoulders increasing. Yes, the 3 members of the Elite Exploration Squad were minions, but they were living minions. That meant they were still human, and only obeyed the Specter due to manipulation. If these experts could think clearly, they would definitely refuse to work with a Specter. Most likely, they had been forced into compliance by the chief Zephyx Extractor, having their minds permanently altered against their will. Sadly, this specific kind of manipulation couldn't be cured. Some manipulation techniques, like mind seals or hypnosis, could be broken by killing the Specter, but this wasn't one of those. From what Nick had guessed, the Specter imprinted an unbreakable and eternal addiction in its minions. Breaking that addiction would result in a slow and painful death in over 90% of cases, and the few survivors also had a high likelihood of seeking revenge, since they wouldn't perceive their addiction as problematic or wrong. Because of that, the minions had to die. Steve took a deep breath. But that didn't make it any easier. "Good work," Steve answered. "Get ready for Phase 3. "Affirmative," Nick answered. Then Steve looked at Cynthia and Mender. The two of them nodded at Steve with determination. Steve nodded back. "Go," he shouted. Then Steve pulled out his 2 rapiers and jumped over the wall behind him. Cynthia pulled out her 2 guns and jumped after Steve. Mender pulled out his sniper rifle and looked over the wall. Steve and Cynthia fell towards the streets below, where the entrance to Vandalize was located. Bang, bang. Cynthia released 2 shots. Crack, crack. The 2 barriers of the people guarding the entrance exploded, but they didn't suffer any injuries. Cynthia had purposefully shot just a slight bit beside them. That would activate their barriers but not hit their bodies. The 2 guards were only Johns, and according to what Nick had reported, they were almost certainly not minions. Nick was quite sure that only peak veterans and higher were minions. After all, every additional minion increased the chance of being found out. Because of that, Vandalize would only show their true selves to their elites. Steve and Cynthia landed in front of the entrance. The next moment, several more people landed in front of the entrance. All of these people wore the uniforms of the city guard, and they quickly contained the 2 guards from Vandalize. While the city guard wouldn't enter the building, they would remain outside to contain the humans. The governor was under a lot of scrutiny, and they didn't want to appear like they were taking advantage of this situation. They would let Steve's squad handle all the killing and cleaning up inside the building. As long as no member of the city guard or any other manufacturer entered the building, no one could blame the governor. Several of the city guards immediately started isolating the area, forcing every person far away from the building. Meanwhile, Steve and Cynthia entered the building. As soon as they entered, they saw several normal employees. Bang! Cynthia fired at a wall, and a green cloud exploded out of it, rapidly blanketing the entire floor. The people couldn't even decide what to do before they lost control over their faculties and fell to the ground. The green cloud was a special gas Aegis used to take normal people and newbies out of a fight without injuring them. Surprisingly, the gas seemed extremely good at spreading. It was almost like the individual particles inside the gas were rejecting each other, forcing the entire cloud to disperse faster and faster. Within 3 seconds, the gas already covered a radius of 50 meters around the building, and within 10 seconds, almost every room within the building came into contact with it. All the normal people lost consciousness. Naturally, none of this passed without being noticed. Almost immediately, red lights appeared all over the building while loud sirens rang out. Moments after the alarms began ringing, several people wearing the uniforms of Vandalize came out of the city and ran towards the building. "Nobody move," the leader of the city guards commanded. The leader of the city guards was a late specialist, and he could take Vandalize down on his own. Sadly, the unstable politics in the city forbade him from killing anyone. Nevertheless, he could still assist by using his authority to suppress any members coming to help Vandalize. An instant later, the captain's barrier began to shine in a bright, warm yellow light as he lifted a scroll. Aegis has found that the leaders of Vandalize are minions. Every member of Vandalize found to resist will be executed immediately, the captain shouted. When the newcomers saw the order, they felt like their world was breaking apart. Yet over half of them immediately thought this was another one of the governor's tricks to suppress Vandalize. Crack! Suddenly, the barrier of one of the members broke into pieces, and his head turned into bloody dust. Bang! An instant later, the sound of a high-caliber rifle shot thundered throughout the surroundings. Everyone looked with shock at the headless corpse. Up above, on top of a building, Mender reloaded. He looked suspiciously calm, but his heart rate had already skyrocketed to unreal levels. The corpse was of a peak veteran belonging to Vandalize. This had to be a minion. Mender had killed a human. Yet the only thing he consciously felt was some form of grayness or emptiness in his chest. He didn't feel atrocious or anything. It was just empty. It was like he had destroyed a mannequin. Then Mender found another peak veteran from Vandalize. His rifle aimed at the newcomer. Boom! Her head also turned into white mist as her barrier broke apart. At that moment, panic broke out and everyone started to flee. The city guards also started to move, but they were not in a panic. They had already been told how everything would happen. With military precision, they charged at every member of Vandalize who dared to move and wasn't a peak veteran. The power of the city guards vastly outclassed Vandalize, and all of their extractors that dared to come close to the building were apprehended. However, none of them were injured or brought out of sight. All of them were contained in public, visible to everyone. It was imperative that everything the city guards did was in view of the public. They could not allow the opposition to sow even more doubt and uncertainty. Mender looked around. He saw another peak veteran. It was a woman who tried to sneak into the building from the top. Mender's rifle aimed at her. And he fired. Chapter 588, First Kills. Cynthia stopped in the middle of the ground floor of the building. In front of her were 3 doors leading into extractor shafts, while to her side were 2 doors leading to staircases. One of the biggest weaknesses of the building was that these were the only ways to move between floors, making it easier to guard them. Although that could also be considered a strength, since the enemy only needed to guard this area to hold off all invasions. Cynthia eyed all of the doors, while Steve charged through one door after the other, checking through all of the rooms. Steve kicked in all the doors, inspected the rooms, and left again. Whenever he checked a room, he used his barrier to scan for signs of any other barriers. If it felt one inside the room, it would send an alarm to Steve. When Steve kicked in a door, his insides seemingly constricted in nervousness. He knew that he had to kill people today, but he was still hoping he wouldn't find any powerful person. Bang! Steve kicked in another door. Ding! Steve's barrier warned him, and he immediately focused on the back of the room. There was a person at the back, but to Steve's highly trained senses, they were moving extremely slowly. In an instant, Steve arrived in front of them. The person froze. Veterans had an acute sense for Zephyx, and they could somewhat estimate the power of another extractor based on the density of Zephyx they felt. These senses couldn't pinpoint someone's exact level, but they were precise enough to tell them that the other person was either so weak that they were not a threat or so strong that fighting was meaningless. Right now, the person felt that Steve was so strong that they couldn't even attempt fighting. So they immediately threw up their arms in surrender. Steve grabbed the person's arm, ran out of the room, and threw them towards the exit. "Surrender to the guards. Wait for further instructions," he shouted. At that moment, the person felt a wave of relief wash over them, but they quickly followed Steve's order and came out of the building with their hands raised. The guards quickly took them into custody. This was only a mid-veteran. Steve was a late expert. Steve continued opening doors. Bang! Suddenly, one of the doors to the stairwell exploded, its splinters hitting the surrounding walls. At the same time, thick purple fog flooded the first floor, making it difficult to see anything. Immediately, Cynthia's barrier activated, and an image overlaid. It showed people rushing out of the stairwell. Cynthia felt her heart beating in her ears. The enemy. This was the enemy. She had to stop them. She shot at the first person. Bang! But hit the wall behind them. She had missed. Next, Cynthia saw the silhouette of the person turning towards her. Bang, bang, bang. Bullets scattered around Cynthia, and a couple even hit her barrier. At that point, Cynthia panicked. Bang, bang, bang. And shot back. The silhouettes her barrier was portraying turned into shiny pieces before vanishing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. After Cynthia had killed the 7th person, no one else dared to come to the ground floor. Cynthia's ears were ringing constantly, and her eyes were torn open. She wasn't thinking about anything. Her body was looking for any remaining attackers. Status, Steve shouted as he arrived near her. Out of reflex, Cynthia pointed her gun at Steve, but she quickly regained control and lowered it before she could truly lock onto him. "I am fine," she answered. "They came through the right staircase. I dealt with everyone that passed through." Cynthia was trying her best to sound professional, but her voice shook occasionally. When Steve heard that, his own anxiety lessened. For some reason, hearing Cynthia's repressed fear and anxiety calmed Steve down and gave him a clear mind. "Good work, continue," Steve ordered as he returned to checking through the rooms. Boom! The sound of a sniper rifle firing entered the building. Steve and Cynthia knew that Mender had just shot someone. When Cynthia heard that, she calmed down a bit. She was not the only one in this situation. The purple fog quickly lifted as it turned back into prefix. Obviously, the fog had been an ability of an enemy extractor. As the fog lifted, Cynthia finally saw the corpses. She felt like the organs in her chest shook in horror. She had seen corpses many times in her past, but never one of someone she had killed. Brains, blood, bones, organs, fluids. Headless corpses. Bloody chunks. What she was looking at didn't even feel human. It was just meat. Boom! Suddenly, Cynthia's barrier activated, and she saw a huge bullet turning into scrap as it hit her barrier. It was the bullet of a sniper rifle. Cynthia felt that she lost some Zephyx and immediately turned to the other staircase. Bang! Out of instinct, she shot through the new hole in the door and saw a shower of blood appear behind it. A moment later, Cynthia realized how much Zephyx she had lost. Around 3%. That was barely anything. That meant the person who had shot at her had been an early veteran at most. She realized all of this, but she only felt grayness in her chest. This incident was put in the back of her mind, and she focused on the task at hand again. No other incident happened until Steve was done checking through all of the rooms on the ground floor. "Ground floor clear. Mender, is the outside secure?" Steve asked. "Perimeter has been established," Mender answered as he looked at the surroundings of the building. By now, the entire surroundings were covered with guards, and no one had escaped from the building for over a minute. Naturally, while the squad had to do the dirty work, they were not completely alone. They were working for Aegis, and the city guards were supporting them. While the guards would not kill anyone, they would still apprehend anyone who tried to escape the building. "Good, advance," Steve ordered. Mender put his rifle away and jumped over the wall. He landed in front of the main entrance and entered. When Mender saw the staircases and extractor shafts, he laid down and pulled out his rifle. This building was hard enough to resist the power of mid-experts, which meant the vast majority of people could only change floors via windows, staircases, or shafts. Naturally, if they broke through the windows, the city guards would take care of them. Steve had secured the entire floor, which meant the enemies could only be on the other floors now. This meant Mender would not get ambushed. Only the chief Zephyx Extractor and the rogue fanatic could break through the floors and walls. While Mender waited here, Steve and Cynthia charged into the extractor shaft to go to the next floor. As soon as Steve entered the shaft, he saw several people aiming their guns at him. Steve narrowed his eyes and jumped upward. Bang, bang, bang. The people unleashed a hail of bullets, but none of them were fast enough to hit Steve, who was over 3 levels stronger than the strongest of the ambushers. Bang! Steve broke the barrier of the first person, grabbed them, and threw them down the shaft. This was only an initial veteran, which meant they were not minions. They didn't have to die. Steve quickly reached the next people and did the same to them. After just 2 seconds, 4 people were thrown down. Bang, bang. While Steve was looking for any more enemies, he heard gunshots from below him. One of the veterans had somehow recovered some Zephyx and was shooting at someone outside the extractor shaft. Bang! And then their head exploded. When Steve saw that, his insides churned. They had attacked him, but since he didn't have the guts to kill them, he had just incapacitated them, and because of that decision, they were now attacking his teammate, forcing Cynthia to kill them. "I'm a failure," he shouted at himself. It was his job to kill them. But due to his weakness and insecurity, he had put another life on Cynthia's conscience. Steve gritted his teeth and jumped down. Crash! He landed on top of the people and cut all their heads off with his rapiers. He had already messed up and forced Cynthia to do his work for him. He would not do so again. Steve looked out of the door and looked at Cynthia. She nodded at him. He nodded back. Then Steve jumped upward again and entered the second floor. A moment later, Cynthia entered as well and joined him. As Mender kept watch over the staircase and shafts, he heard more shots. Cynthia and Steve were fighting on the other floors. Bang! And then the floor below him exploded, and his barrier activated. Chapter 589, Orders. Bang! Mender's barrier activated, and he was immediately thrown back as someone broke through the floor. As soon as the floor broke, Mender knew it was either the Chief Zephyx Extractor or the Specter. Mender quickly regained his footing and aimed his sniper rifle forward. However, as soon as he looked forward again, he saw the cold yellow eyes of a woman directly in front of him. The Chief Zephyx Extractor. Mender tried to aim at her, but she was too close. Bang! Another attack hit Mender, and he lost almost 50% of his Zephyx. Steve and Cynthia wouldn't be able to get there in time, even if they realized what was going on. The Chief Zephyx Extractor quickly shot after Mender to destroy his barrier. If she managed to do that, she could put him under the influence of the Lord, which would hopefully open up a way to escape this situation. Mender tried his best, but she was on him again before he could do anything. At that moment, light exploded out of her, and Mender lost track of his surroundings. Bang! Mender was hit again and flew backward. He knew there wasn't much he could do, but he still tried to regain control over his body. He pulled his rifle up and aimed forward. Headless corpse. Mender's arms shook as his crosshair moved back and forth. But there was nothing to shoot at. The Chief Zephyx Extractor had turned into a headless corpse. Mender's hands jerked to the side, and the sniper rifle aimed at the person standing beside the corpse. His arms shook more before he took a deep breath and lowered his rifle. Nick just nodded at him neutrally. Naturally, it hadn't been the Chief Zephyx Extractor who had released the light. It had been Nick who had been behind her. Nick wanted to make sure Mender's perception wouldn't mess with his ability. Bang! Cynthia and Steve charged out of the extractor shaft and looked around. When they saw the corpse and Nick, they relaxed. Phase 3 complete, Nick said evenly. Phase 1 had been to kill the most powerful members who were not currently inside the building. Phase 2 had been the invasion and clearing of the first floor. Phase 3 had been to lure out the Chief Zephyx Extractor and let Nick and Mender kill her. Nick had reported that the rogue Specter was in the basement. The first logical thing the Chief Zephyx Extractor would do after realizing they were under attack would be to go to the Specter to see if it was still okay and receive orders. After that, she would wait for a chance to attack, since she couldn't just flee. The only way out was to manipulate Steve's squad and let herself and the Specter get suppressed, and then released again outside the city. A lonely sniper in the middle of a big hall. Wasn't that the best target? Yet that lonely sniper had only been bait. According to the plan, the Chief Zephyx Extractor would attack Mender. She was more powerful than him, but not powerful enough to destroy his entire barrier with one attack. As soon as Mender was pushed back, Nick would join the battle and attack her. Lastly, Mender would kill her from a distance with a devastating shot. Everything played out just as expected, except for the very last part. Phase 3 completed, Steve echoed. Then he turned around and charged into the extractor shaft again with Cynthia. They still needed to clear the building. Mender went back to watching over the staircases, and Nick entered the hole the Chief Zephyx Extractor had created. Time passed. Over the next 30 minutes, people were continually thrown out of the windows of the building. All of them were extractors and strong enough to survive such a fall. Naturally, everyone thrown out of the building was also apprehended by the city guards. After 40 minutes, all the floors were cleared. Steve and Cynthia had found and eradicated all 3 team leads, who had all been initial experts. Mender had killed a couple more peak veterans, and the other 2 also dealt with a couple of them. There were only 2 peak veterans left, but the team didn't know where they were. It was possible they were holed up in some containment units. While Steve and Cynthia were checking through the locker rooms of the containment units, they didn't enter any of them. These were Specters, and entering containment units without exactly knowing what a Specter was about could end horribly. Analyzing all the Specters would happen once the battle was over and the city took hold of the building. Eventually, the 3 of them gathered on the ground floor again. Phase 4 complete, Steve announced without activating his barrier. A moment later, he activated it and sent a signal. Almost immediately, he received a signal back. It was from Nick, and it meant that nothing had changed. Naturally, Nick was tasked with guarding the entrance to the rogue fanatic. He had to make sure it didn't escape. Steve nodded and gestured for the team to enter the staircase. Then all 3 of them entered the staircase and traveled towards the underground floor. As they went down, they became calmer. Yes, the Specter was more powerful than any of the human enemies here, but it was also just a Specter. They dealt with Specters all the time. The only truly scary part was that they weren't entirely sure how powerful it was. They knew it was a fanatic, but the power difference between an initial and a peak fanatic was gigantic. When they reached the door leading to the big storage room, they stopped. Nick had marked the door for them. Once more, Steve activated his barrier and sent the signal. Nick's signal came back. Feeling it helped Steve calm down again. Then Steve opened the door. Mender and Cynthia stayed behind him and kept their weapons ready. Yet as soon as the door opened, Steve noticed something. It was Nick. But he wasn't alone. There was also a small ball with 6 wings hovering beside him. Immediately, everyone knew what this meant. "Nick, report," Steve ordered aggressively as everyone aimed at the Specter. According to the plan, Nick was supposed to stay hidden and check if anyone left the room. He was not supposed to engage the Specter on his own. Even more importantly, the Specter was supposed to be killed. They were not supposed to negotiate with it or contain it. Shirley declared the Specter deadly, and they were supposed to execute it. So why was Nick suddenly standing there, beside it in front of them? "It found me," Nick said. "My orders were not to engage, and I didn't engage." Then Nick pointed at the Zephyx suppressor around one of the Specter's wings. "It surrendered willingly, and I took it into custody," he explained. Steve was enraged and glared at Nick. "Cynthia, keep Nick in your sight," Steve ordered. Cynthia grew more nervous, but she followed her orders. Nick didn't seem to react. "Mender, shoot the Specter," Steve ordered. After saying that, Steve glared at Nick, keeping his weapons ready. Mender aimed his rifle at the Specter. "You sure you want to do this?" Nick asked calmly. "This is an early fanatic, you know. It also gives an impressive ability and is easy to work with." Mender hesitated. "Shoot it," Steve shouted, glaring at Nick. "The Specter has been classified as deadly and has to be killed." "Because we weren't powerful enough to suppress it without putting our squad at risk," Nick argued. "Our squad is no longer at risk. Plans have to adapt to new circumstances, and wasting this Specter would be a big misstep." Mender didn't fire yet. After a second, he looked at Steve. "Nick's words make sense. Are you sure we should kill the Specter?" "Orders are orders," Steve shouted. "We are on a mission. You can talk to me and criticize me all you want outside the mission, but during the mission, you have to follow orders." Mender looked at Nick. His gaze was uncertain. All of this felt way too risky. "Follow your orders," Steve shouted at him. "You do it," Mender answered. "If anyone attacks you, I will shoot them." Cynthia's and Steve's eyes widened in shock. They had not expected this answer. Mender was refusing to follow orders. Sure, Nick had also done that, but he actually had a reason to, and he didn't straight up refuse to kill the Specter. "Cynthia, kill it," Steve ordered. Cynthia took a deep breath. Then she lifted her guns and targeted the ball. Bang, bang, bang. She unleashed several shots. Ding, ding, ding. All 3 were blocked. But not by the Specter. Chapter 590, Final Loyalty Test. Cynthia's bullets were blocked and fell to the ground as they hit a white barrier. When they saw who blocked the bullets, their eyes widened. "Tutor," Steve exclaimed in shock. Shirley stood in front of the Specter. She was the one who had blocked the bullets. Usually, Shirley was always outside the mission area, leaving everything up to the team. If they messed up, the mission would fail, and innocent people would die. It was important that these experiences were genuine. When Steve saw that Nick showed no reaction, he realized what had happened. This was a test, and Nick was in on it. Shirley looked at the team. "The mission is genuine." This elicited some raised eyebrows. "Wait, the mission was genuine. Wasn't this a test?" "This was not supposed to be a test originally," Shirley explained. "However, I decided to spontaneously transform this mission into the final loyalty test. Every squad has to get past the final loyalty test, and it is the very test that will decide whether or not Aegis will invest more into you. The existence of the final loyalty test is confidential, and nobody is allowed to talk about it to anyone who has not undergone it themselves. That is why none of you knew about its existence. In order for second-level trainees to become third-level trainees, they need to fulfill several requirements. First, they need to have completed over 100 training missions successfully. Second, they need to be peak experts. Third, they need experience killing the enemies of Aegis in both forms, Specters and humans. Fourth, they need the endorsement of their tutor. And fifth, they need to complete the final loyalty test. The final loyalty test puts the squad in a situation that will make them question their loyalties. Those situations include betrayal of a powerful member of the squad, life-threatening danger, high bribes, and similar things. I already gave all of you my endorsement, and I believe the final loyalty test was only a formality, Shirley said. Then her eyes fell on Mender, whose face had already turned white. But apparently I was mistaken. I didn't betray anyone, Mender shouted defensively. I didn't attack Steve. I even told him I would protect him from anyone who attacked. Mender, Shirley spoke seriously. During a critical moment in a mission, you defied your leader's orders repeatedly. You feared that Nick had betrayed Aegis and were afraid everyone in the squad would be killed by him. You wanted to secure your own life by betraying Aegis. While securing your life can be acceptable if you take a neutral stance, taking a neutral stance during a critical part of a mission counts as a betrayal. You were supposed to kill the Specter, and you refused. Mender's face turned white, and he gritted his teeth. What about him? Mender shouted, pointing at Nick. What about his loyalty? Nick didn't react. Nick's loyalty has already been confirmed by the Extractress herself, Shirley said. In her own words, Nick has proven his loyalty more times than necessary. Mender looked like his world was crashing down. He just wanted to survive. Was that so wrong? Without waiting for Mender's answer, Shirley looked at Cynthia. Good work. You acted when Mender failed. Cynthia nodded, refusing to look at Mender. She was angry and ashamed. She was ashamed because she had thought Mender would have her back. And yet he was about to betray Aegis, which included her. Then Shirley looked at Steve. You acted correctly, Steve, she said. Getting close to the Specter would have been too risky, so you ordered someone with a gun to deal with it while retaining your formation. Killing the Specter first would have also cleared the uncertainty surrounding Nick's allegiance. If he had joined the Specter, he would have been forced to attack you before the gun fired. If he truly only wanted to suggest something, he would sit by and let you kill the Specter. One case equates to execution for betrayal, while the other is an interrogation and reprimand. You handled the situation perfectly. After hearing all of these praises, Steve should have been happy. But he wasn't. Mender's betrayal at the most critical moment had hit him pretty hard. Additionally, Steve looked at Nick. If Nick had truly betrayed them, Steve felt like they would have all been killed. Steve felt like Nick's true power was endless. That thought also scared him. Nick, please take out the Specter cage, Shirley said. Next, Nick took out his space bag and pulled out a huge black cube. When the other three saw that, their eyes widened in shock. Why did Nick have a space bag? Not even their tutor had one. Not even all of the agents had one. Space bags were only given to extremely powerful extractors who had contributed a lot to Aegis. There was no way to purchase them. Naturally, when Shirley heard that Nick had a space bag, she was just as shocked. A couple of months ago, Shirley had visited the Extractress to talk to her about Nick. Shirley had felt she couldn't get a read on him. Everything about him was too mysterious, and she felt very suspicious of him. Instead of directly answering her questions, the Extractress just asked questions about Nick. How strong was he? Was he reliable? Did he learn a lot? What was his progress? Shirley answered all of the questions. Nick was outstanding in everything, but she was still concerned about his loyalty. At that time, the Extractress showed Nick's full file to her. When she saw that Nick technically outranked her, she didn't know how to respond. For over 8 years, she had ordered someone around like a trainee, even though that person was actually their superior. When she read about Nick's accomplishments, she became even more shocked. While this guy was not powerful enough to be a true help against the Specters, he was still impacting all of Aegis. After all, if his methods proved to work, the way Aegis ran all the cities in the world would change fundamentally. Naturally, all of Shirley's doubts vanished, and the Extractress told her that Nick didn't need to go through the final loyalty test. Even if Nick somehow failed, he would still stay in Aegis. He had contributed too much to get rid of him for something like that. Naturally, when Shirley returned to the team, she continued acting like nothing had changed, but Nick immediately felt that she was acting differently from normal. So at some point, he asked her privately what was up. Seeing Nick in a new light, Shirley felt bad about keeping things hidden. She had no issues lying to a trainee, but lying to someone who technically outranked her was something completely different. In the end, they talked about some things and decided the final loyalty test should be held soon. Nick would leave the squad after the test. When the mission came in, they decided the final loyalty test would be held then and there. While the plan was being carried out, Shirley covertly entered the basement of Vandaliz's building. After the chief Zephyx Extractor died, the Specter immediately tried to escape. Naturally, Shirley stopped it and contained it. As long as it played along, they wouldn't kill it. Of course, the Specter didn't have any other choice, and since it didn't want to die. "Get into the cage," Shirley commanded. The Specter entered the cage without resisting. Entering the cage meant they wouldn't kill it, which was what it wanted. The cage closed, and the fanatic was officially contained. Shirley glanced at the cage and couldn't suppress a small, devious smirk. That Specter was unworkable. It only gained power by working with strong extractors, and any strong extractor it worked with would become its slave. He just didn't exactly have a great number of criminal specialists or heroes, and there were plenty of Specters that fed on those already. They didn't need another one. This Specter would get to experience a new execution method. Around 10 years ago, Aegis had found a Specter that could consume other Specters to produce Zephyx and become more powerful. Thanks to this Specter, Aegis had saved a lot of costs in keeping Specters suppressed without having to redistribute their Zephyx into the atmosphere. Naturally, that new Specter was the Crimson Sea. Sure enough, the Crimson Sea's unique attributes made it very valuable to Aegis. The only bad thing was that it took up a lot of space. Keeping it in a small cube deactivated all of its abilities, which was bad in this case. They needed its abilities to kill Specters. Nick also knew that the Specter would be fed to the Crimson Sea soon. He found it a bit funny that some random Specter he got to meet somewhere in the world would die to the Crimson Sea, a Specter that had impacted Nick's life severely. The little adolescent puddle Nick let out in the building of the Spartans was now going to kill a fanatic that had lived on the other side of the world. It was funny how the world worked sometimes. Chapter 591, Purpose. "I heard you're leaving," Steve said as he looked at the ruins of New York around Aegis headquarters. There were several terraces all over the pyramid, and they could be accessed by anyone working for Aegis. Looking at the ruins from ancient times was strange. Some of the pieces of rubble were so big that they could have only come from buildings kilometers tall. It was almost like every single building was a megastructure back then. An entire city filled with nothing but megastructures. How many people would live there? How long did it take to build such a city? Nick also looked at the rubble. Yet compared to Steve, Nick knew a lot more about the ancient ones. Over the past years, Nick had focused a lot on history, and he also learned a lot about ancient technologies. The ancient ones had no access to Zephyx materials, but they managed to create many different kinds of matter with different attributes. Then, by perfectly placing them, all the weaknesses of these bits of matter vanished, leaving only their strengths. It was like building a group of combatants in which people could cover for each other's weaknesses. Naturally, it was much more complex to pull off than it sounded. There couldn't be any impurities in any part of the megastructure, which was something Aegis couldn't achieve. Impurities weren't that important for Aegis, since Zephyx materials were many times more durable and flexible than any normal bit of matter. The ancient ones must have been unimaginably advanced in technology. Steve just kept looking at Nick, who wasn't answering. Was Nick distracted by something? "Sorry," Nick said absent-mindedly. "I was thinking about something. Yes, I'm leaving." Steve sighed. "So that only leaves me and Cynthia." Nick nodded. Naturally, Mender had been fired after the mission. He was sent back to his city and wouldn't be allowed to rejoin Aegis in the future unless his contributions became extremely impressive. And now Nick was also leaving. "What's your actual background?" Steve asked. "You can tell me now, right?" Nick remained silent for a bit, but compared to all the previous times Steve asked such a question, he didn't leave immediately. "Check the database for the title of liaison," Nick said. Steve's eyebrows rose. Finally, Nick was talking about himself. Steve pulled out a little pad and pressed a couple of buttons. His eyebrows rose more and more as he kept reading. "Are you the guy they're talking about in here?" Steve asked, pointing at a paragraph that mentioned there was currently only a single liaison, running experiments on different cities. Nick nodded. Steve took a deep breath, So you changed an entire city already. Nick nodded again. That's also why I got my space bag. Steve glanced at it, increasing an entire city's output by 20%, while simultaneously increasing the average quality of life for the citizens. That was a crazy accomplishment. Steve realized that Nick was truly on a different level. Nick had achieved something that only governors could achieve. So you were never a trainee? Steve asked. I was a trainee, Nick said. Steve could see that Nick was technically speaking the truth, but that was akin to saying that a hero working for a new and weak manufacturer was a new employee at an up-and-coming startup. Technically right, but it wouldn't paint an accurate picture. Why go through all of this? Steve asked. He didn't know why Nick would go through so much trouble. He didn't need any of this. I had the same question when the Extractors sent me here for the first time, Nick said. I only wanted to increase my power so I could become a specialist soon. However, I very quickly learned that being here taught me a lot. I could test my knowledge and learn about different forms of academia. While I didn't need more practice fighting or working with Specters, the one thing I always lacked was a formal education. And I learned even more during the second phase. I traveled to many different cities in the Great Triangle, and I saw how all of them operate. I've seen all manner of ways the governors rule over the different cities, and I could see their advantages and disadvantages. The last 9 years have not been in vain, and I don't feel like I've missed any opportunities to gain more experience. It was the right thing to make me a trainee, Nick explained. Steve looked at Nick with a bit of surprise. He had never heard Nick speak so much. That made him seem very different in Steve's eyes. It was almost like this wasn't Nick. For the first time, the distant image that Nick was to Steve had finally become clearer. Sadly, this happened only when Nick was just about to leave the squad. At that point, Steve remembered something. Wait, if you have the rank of governor already and are living here, does that mean your family already lives here as well? Steve asked. Nick didn't immediately answer. No, he said after a bit without elaborating. Steve grimaced a bit. Same thing with you. Something like that, Nick said. Naturally, the matter of family was not easy for any trainee. Steve had seen his family only once within the last 12 years. Yet that wasn't as bad as it sounded. The matter of family for these elite progenies was complex. Many of them had been brought up with the expectation of reciprocity drilled into them. Ever since they were small children, they had heard that they needed to perform exceptionally so the entire family would benefit. This made the relationship with their family feel very transactional. Different trainees dealt with these expectations differently. As for Steve, he was not sure anymore what to do, and he had told Nick about that. He felt indebted to his family for investing so much in him and giving him his opportunity, but he felt no love for them. He did not look forward to seeing them. He only wanted to get them into Aegis headquarters, so he didn't need to feel indebted anymore. Naturally, Nick didn't have these issues. After all, he didn't have a family. 2 silhouettes of a man and woman shot through Nick's mind. Nick thought about his parents from time to time. He had no idea who they had been, and he would most likely never find out. Whenever the null killed anything, all records of the event were expunged. The less people knew about the null, the better. More importantly, he didn't want to find out. By knowing more about his past, Nick might regain his memories from before he was 10, which would also bring back memories of the fateful day, meaning he'd remember what the null looked like. Knowing what the null looked like was probably just as dangerous as saying the sentence. What will you do now? Steve asked. Nick kept looking at the ruins. Advance and quickly get through the consumption. Steve sighed. Right, we can already think about that. It's closer than I thought. Don't waste your opportunity, Nick said. I won't, Steve said. While I am certain I can get past it, I know my result will be at best above average. What level are you aiming at? Nick asked. I want a mid-elder, Steve said. Nick furrowed his brows. I know, Steve added. It's my goal. I know I need a lot more mental fortitude and strength. Nick looked at Steve. You have to change drastically if you want to survive a mid-elder. Steve furrowed his brows. I know I need more mental fortitude, but you act like it's impossible for me. It might as well be, Nick said, eliciting an annoyed frown from Steve. You're missing something fundamental. And what's that? Steve asked. A purpose, Nick said. Steve raised an eyebrow. A purpose. A purpose that drives you to survive and become stronger, Nick said. Your current purpose is to repay the debt to your family and to see where things are headed. You are not becoming stronger for a loved one, and you are not filled with ambition. You are mostly just coasting along to see how things turn out. Only try a mid-elder if you know exactly why you're risking your life. There is a reason why 50% of all extractors die when they attempt the consumption. Steve became more annoyed and wanted to argue with Nick. However, Nick just turned around and walked back into the building. "Don't kill yourself because of your stupid pride," Nick said before entering. Steve became frustrated and looked away from the building. Minutes passed. A purpose? Didn't he have a purpose? Did Nick have a purpose? Chapter 592, Peak Expert. The next day, Nick officially left the squad. They had spent 8 years together, and Nick left just like that. He didn't even say goodbye to anyone. Steve and Cynthia felt a bit regretful. It didn't feel good to lose contact so suddenly with somebody they'd known for so long. They had gone through many dangers together, and they had grown up together. Yet there had always been this wall between them and Nick. The other three had felt pretty close, but Nick had always been isolated from them. But that was it. It was over. Just like that, Nick was gone from their lives. Steve's and Cynthia's squad merged with another that only had 2. Usually, deaths were common among the squads, and there were plenty of trainees searching for new squads. Cynthia hadn't been certain why so many people died during the missions. Sure, their squad had been in a couple of dangerous situations, but things had never appeared uncontrollable. Even during their latest mission against Vandalize, they hadn't been in true danger. Yet, during their last couple of years as Level 2 trainees, 2 people of their squad had died to unforeseen circumstances. Additionally, missions in general seemed to become much more dangerous. "Your missions aren't becoming more dangerous," Shirley told Cynthia 2 years after Nick left the squad. "You're getting the same kind of missions you've always received." Cynthia almost couldn't believe that. There were many more ambushes and traps. Additionally, the enemies were often more numerous than expected and showed abilities they hadn't expected. There were far more surprises in these missions, and a surprise during a mission was almost never a good thing. "The missions are not different," Steve told Cynthia another year later when she mentioned the topic again. "Can't you see what's happening?" Cynthia asked with annoyance. "We lost Charlie yesterday, and we didn't even have a chance of saving him. Such hopeless situations just started occurring 3 years ago." "Yes," Steve answered. "And what happened 3 years ago? What changed?" Cynthia was reminded of Mender and Nick. Mender and Nick left. "There you go," Steve said. Cynthia furrowed her brows. "Are you saying our new teammates are that much worse than Nick and Mender?" "No," Steve said. "Hamill is even better than Mender. Charlie was a very good scout as well, but—" "He wasn't Nick," Steve added. "I didn't want to tell you since I thought you'd realize it yourself one day. Cynthia, our new missions are not harder than our old ones. The difference is just that we're finally carrying our own asses." Cynthia frowned. "Are you seriously suggesting that Nick was carrying us for 8 years? Steve sighed. And then he nodded. "Took me a long while to accept it, but that's exactly it," Steve said. "Almost every unwelcome surprise in the missions is a result of a lack of information. This sounds obvious, but the only reason things are unexpected is because they weren't expected. Charlie was a great scout, but sometimes he was found out, warning the enemy. Sometimes he couldn't travel deep enough behind enemy lines to witness their true power. Sometimes he couldn't tell what a Specter could do exactly since he's not an expert in spectology. And most importantly, I couldn't tell Charlie to assassinate the most powerful enemy every time. Almost every time we were on a mission with Nick, I told him to assassinate the most powerful enemy, and he always delivered. Our fights never included the most powerful enemy. Now they do." Cynthia couldn't answer for a long time, and it took her a while to come to terms with that revelation. Their new teammates were definitely not bad. Whenever she looked at any of her 3 teammates, she didn't look down on anyone. All of them seemed just as outstanding as her, and they could do things she couldn't. And yet the missions were still extremely dangerous. Realizing this gave Cynthia's confidence a heavy hit. She had thought that everyone in their squad had been just as outstanding and on the same level. But that hadn't been the case. Luckily, their powers had already reached levels that reduced the dangers of the missions a lot. Without Nick, they might have already died in the first 8 years. When the squad received their new scout, Cynthia talked with them quite a bit about different missions. "You're exaggerating," the new scout said, a woman with long gray hair. "A late expert scout can't sneak up on a fanatic and watch them without being found out." Yet, whenever Cynthia mentioned something Nick had done in the past, she got harsh pushback from the new scout, who said Cynthia was exaggerating and telling lies. And worst of all, Cynthia kind of had to agree with her. Right, how was that possible? How did Nick actually do that? Cynthia couldn't find an answer. 4 years after Nick left, the squad was dissolved. Everyone had become peak experts and had gained enough experience. For the foreseeable future, they would work towards their consumption and eventual ascension to becoming specialists. Of course, Nick had already been in that process for 4 years. Ever since leaving the squad, Nick had stayed in Aegis headquarters. He worked with Specters to advance in level, and when he wasn't doing that, he went to the big central library to learn more about the different cities, economics, history, math, and so on. Another thing Nick did during these 4 years was practice Zephyx manipulation. The more powerful an extractor became, the more important Zephyx manipulation became. Extractors got access to more Zephyx, meaning the refinement process of Zephyx manipulation no longer required as much time. Focusing on Zephyx manipulation wouldn't pay off in the near future since there was so much to learn, but in the long term, it definitely would. As Nick stayed in Aegis headquarters, he was barely noticed by anyone. Sometimes people noticed him, but no one knew who he was. No one knew his name, and no one knew what he was doing there. He was just a guy who walked from containment units to the library to the training halls and back to the containment units. All day. Every day. 4 years passed, and Nick finally became a peak expert. Nick had reached the age of 49, incomparably young for a peak expert. Even the most talented trainees from the most elite families became peak experts between the ages of 55 and 60. However, the youngest person who had ever become an initial specialist was already 65, and they hadn't been very powerful. The reason was the consumption. Technically, the consumption didn't take a long time. Theoretically, one could go through it at any time, and it would take a couple of weeks at most. Yet nobody attempted the consumption easily. After all, one only had a single chance in their entire life, and the level of success in the consumption would shape someone's entire future. One could use a peak adult for the consumption and survive with 99% certainty. Yet that person would never become a hero in their life. The success of the consumption determined many things. The speed of an extractor's Zephyx absorption, how much they could absorb, how much Zephyx they could store, and how talented they were in Zephyx manipulation. If one performed the consumption with a peak adult, one would need almost a century to become an early specialist from being an initial specialist. With only 300 years of maximum longevity, such a person would never become a hero. In general, only older people who had already given up their dreams of reaching for the stars would choose a peak adult. Most people used initial elders. Advancing a level would still take 50 years, but at least they would become peak specialists in their lifetimes. That was the next best thing after becoming a hero. However, only around 50% of those who attempted the consumption with an initial elder survived. The most talented ones tried early elders, and if they succeeded, they could advance within 30 years. As long as they weren't already pretty old when they became initial specialists, they become peak specialists before turning 200, giving them an entire century to become heroes. However, this was extremely dangerous. Only the most talented people attempted this, and only 30% managed to survive. There were also reports of people attempting the consumption with a mid-elder, but that almost never happened. Someone who succeeded in this only existed in one of 50 cities. People who managed to get through this will be viewed as future protectors by Aegis. As for late elders, someone who managed to get through, that only came about once in several decades in the entire world. Peak elders. According to the records, no one had ever succeeded. Yet if someone had succeeded, it could have only been the champion of light. And Nick hoped he could join him. The champion had given Nick the last name of Dusk. If Nick wanted to live up to this name, and if he wanted to redeem himself, he had to, at least, reach the level of the current son of humanity, the champion of light. Chapter 593, Mental Fortitude. Some of Nick's flesh fell to the ground. Yet he only kept looking forward with an intense gaze. In front of him stood the Adductress, carrying a knife. Just now she had cut off part of Nick's chest. The Adductress looked deep into Nick's eyes with coldness. "Give up," she ordered. "No," Nick spoke coldly. The Adductress knife plunged into Nick's ribcage, breaking through his sternum. Such a wound would be fatal for a normal person. "Consuming a peak elder is too risky," the Adductress spoke. "Even a late elder is already too dangerous." "No," Nick repeated. "Craig." The Adductress moved the knife downward, breaking open Nick's chest and exposing his heart. Nick just gritted his teeth. Nick's chest rapidly healed, but the Adductress kept opening new holes. Naturally, someone like Nick was worth a lot, and Aegis wouldn't allow their members to throw their lives away by biting off more than they could chew. Nick wanted to consume a peak elder, and Aegis would not allow him to go through with that unless he proved his willpower. The Adductress had been cutting away at Nick's body for 3 hours already, and she kept saying he should give up. Yet Nick just kept on going. Craig. The Adductress cut off 2 of Nick's ribs and broke them again, so their ends were filled with spikes. Then she moved the 2 ribs at Nick's eyes. Nick didn't close his eyes and didn't look away. The Adductress watched his eyes closely. Nick hadn't been allowed to blink ever since the torture started. Otherwise, he would prove he didn't have the willpower to consume a peak elder. These trials were designed to be completable in theory, but basically impossible in practice. Theoretically, someone could keep their eyes open for days, but who could actually pull that off? The ends of Nick's broken ribs touched his eyes, but he didn't look away. The Adductress moved the ribs around a bit, and they slightly cut into his eyes. Tiny splinters that had already been loose kept sticking into Nick's eyes as she pulled them back again. The Adductress just looked at Nick, whose eyes were filled with splinters from his own ribs. She gritted her teeth. Didn't this idiot realize he was walking towards his death? It was impossible to consume a peak elder. Allowing Nick to pass this trial represented allowing him to kill himself in the Adductress' eyes. Because of that, she was doing her absolute best to keep him from succeeding. But she only had 24 hours. This wasn't the first time the Adductress had administered this kind of test, but this was the most extreme one she had ever run by far. After all, she was allowed to try absolutely everything, without limit, to dissuade Nick from trying to consume a peak elder. Now, why was all of this necessary, and what was the consumption? For a peak expert to become an initial specialist, one needed to pass the consumption. As the name implied, the consumption represented consuming something. In this case, it represented consuming the core of a Specter. When a human consumed the core of a Specter, their mind would fuse with the Specter. Their 2 essences would combine, and the 2 souls would clash with each other. The one would gain control over the entire body, while the loser would lose all intelligence and sense of self, becoming something like a subservient machine. Since all of this happened within one's mind, mental fortitude was the most important thing. The 2 wills would clash, and their willpowers would weaken the enemy. For humans, the resource they used was willpower. For Specters, it was Zephyx. Why was it different? Because a Specter's willpower was perfect. Specters did not fear pain, imprisonment, weariness, hunger, exhaustion, or suffering. The only thing they feared was death, and they knew that losing this battle meant death. Therefore, the Specters would continue fighting until their very existence stopped working. This was akin to a human who kept fighting until all their muscles tore apart and all their bones broke. A Specter's willpower in this kind of fight could not be matched by a human, simply because they weren't human. Therefore, in a one-on-one fight, the Specter would win 100% of the time. It was like a normal person trying to work longer without breaks than a machine, never allowed to slow down. So the only thing humans could do was consume weaker Specters. This created an imbalance in mental powers. A peak expert who consumed a peak adult could force the Specter into compliance just from the overwhelming power of their soul. It was like a grown human fighting against a rat. One slight weight shift onto the rat would make it feel like a humongous mountain was trying to crush it. That would cause the Specter's Zephyx to burn away at insane rates. Of course, the stronger the Specter was, the smaller the difference in power between the 2 combatants. Consuming a late elder was already considered almost impossible. This was like an average adult human male competing with an average adult human female over how long they could keep a weight of 20 kg held above their heads. At first glance, the answer would be obvious. But what if the female was so insanely determined that she ignored all the pain until all the muscles in her arm, chest, and back hardened and cramped, until they were so damaged that lowering them would break them apart like twigs? Suddenly, the favorite in this battle was no longer the male. And trying to consume a peak elder would be like competing with another male with the same willpower as the female. Even the perfect mental fortitude and attitude wouldn't be enough, since both parties would just die together in a draw. After all, both of them would fight with 100% efficiency. Therefore, there was no point in even trying to consume a peak elder. It was impossible to win. That was why the Extractress wouldn't allow Nick to consume one. She would stop him. Over the next hours, she committed the most horrible acts she could imagine on Nick. Skinning, poisoning, breaking, burning, gouging, destroying. Yet no matter how horrible the acts were, she made sure Nick could still physically keep his eyes open and his body upright. After all, he had to willingly give up. Hours passed. Yet after just 12 hours, the Extractress stopped and just looked at Nick. He was still looking at her with determined eyes. She was out of ideas. How could anyone get past all this torture without cracking? What drove Nick to such a point? What made him this determined to kill himself? After so many hours of torture, Nick didn't even seem like a human anymore to the Extractress. Torturing Nick accomplished the same thing as torturing a Specter. Absolutely nothing. Why do you want to kill yourself this badly? The Extractress asked. Nick didn't answer. Do you really intend to go through with this? She asked again, her voice calmer than before. Yes, Nick replied, his voice weak but steely. The Extractress took a deep breath and looked away. I hoped you would accomplish great things, she said. Then she sighed. Sadly, your journey ends here. She looked back at Nick. Consuming a peak elder is impossible. It is physically impossible. There is no potential reward to be gained from granting you this opportunity, but we will be losing a peak elder. This is a pure loss for Aegis. You no longer have any value. You are someone who is going to die soon, and forcing you to relent will only make you betray us and try in secret. Therefore, I will do the same thing Aegis does to everyone else who tries to consume a peak elder. The Extractress pointed her hand at Nick. Bang! Nick's body exploded and scattered across the room. Bang! Nick's head hit the ground. What a waste, the Extractress lamented as she looked at it. Yet Nick's head was still looking at her. His eyes were still focused. The Extractress looked back. There was no remorse. There was no wavering. He had done his best. He had done his absolute best to redeem himself. Did he succeed? No, but he tried his best. The Extractress released a shaky breath. The next moment, healing liquid exploded out of the ceiling and doused Nick's head. Slowly, Nick's body began to reform. Naturally, a normal person would have already died. In fact, even a normal extractor would have already died. The only reason Nick didn't was that his willpower kept him alive for just a couple more seconds. Nevertheless, it wasn't easy to bring Nick back from the dead, and the Extractress had to use several different gadgets and medicines to keep him stable while his body reformed. Yet during all of this, Nick didn't lose consciousness, and he did not lose any of his fighting spirit. In the end, Nick stood reformed in front of the Extractress. He still hadn't blinked. One last time the Extractress sighed. You win, she spoke with resignation. You'll get your peak elder in 1 week. Chapter 594, Consumption. Nick walked into a big room. A couple of people were already there. The Extractress stood in the middle and looked at Nick with a serious expression. Beside her stood an older man with gray hair. Nick actually knew this person. This was Marvin, a protector working under the technician. Marvin had been one of the 4 inspectors who had looked at Crimson City. The last person was a middle-aged man carrying an expensive console. Based on the man's uniform, he was a governor, which almost made Nick raise an eyebrow. This is Protector Marvin Marvel, the Extractress said, gesturing to the older man. You already know each other. We do, Marvin said with a smile. Nick nodded. Then the Extractress gestured to the other person. This is a scribe. Nick nodded. He knew what a scribe was. He just hadn't known that this was one. A scribe was someone who belonged to Aegis, and whose task was to administrate the central database. While governors and agents were allowed to add things to the database, they could only do so by commissioning a scribe. The only ones who could add things without supervision were protectors and stronger. Naturally, to make things official, the Adductress had commissioned a scribe to record everything that happened. It was important that Aegis had a paper trail when Nick inevitably died after consuming the Peak Elder. The scribe stepped forward, and his barrier activated a moment later. Nick's barrier activated in response and blinked a couple of times. "Nick Dusk," the scribe said, "identity confirmed." Next, the scribe took out a couple of documents and handed them to Nick. "Read these and sign them." Nick grabbed the documents and read through them. It was a whole bunch of legal bullshit, essentially saying that Aegis was not killing him, and that he was the one who asked them to consume a Peak Elder. Nick signed everything without complaint. Finally, he handed the documents back, and the scribe scanned them through his barrier. The scribe looked at the Adductress and nodded. "You can proceed." The Adductress looked at Nick. "You requested the core of the dark cloud," she said. Nick nodded. Naturally, the choice of Specter was also important. Choosing the right one wouldn't make the consumption easier or harder, but it would shape one's future talent in Zephyx manipulation. The Specter core that would become one's subservient processor had its own things it was good and bad at. It wasn't some kind of new, untouched core with no prior history. The core was already shaped, and the extractor wouldn't be able to reshape it. The dark cloud the Specter Nick had chosen was a Peak Elder, and just as the name suggested, it looked like a black cloud. It was a force specter that consumed all the light around it, encasing its victims in darkness and allowing the nightmare to torture them. It was one of several specters that used the nightmare as a form of inflicting suffering on humanity. Naturally, force specters were extremely good at being elusive and escaping, which was exactly what Nick wanted to specialize in. He didn't want to be found by an enemy, and if he were found, he wanted to escape as quickly as possible. The dark cloud was perfect for that. The Adductress turned around and walked to a corner of the room, to a big black cube. A Specter cage. Her barrier blinked for a moment, and the door of the cube opened. Whoom! Immediately, a thick cloud of darkness shot past the opening. Xiang, xiang, xiang. The Adductress pulled out one of her swords and released several quick slashes. To Nick, it seemed like the slashes were all performed at the same instant. When she slashed, the area around her sword seemed to distort. The black cloud was separated several times, and the cut-off part turned into air. It was like the Adductress was cutting off marble to form a sculpture. After an unknown number of slashes, a black crystal poked out of the black cloud. Naturally, if these were just regular slashes, nothing like this would happen. Fortunately, the Adductress was also a suppressor. Ding! The tip of her sword touched the crystal, and all the black smoke vanished. The crystal fell to the ground, and moments later, it started to hover in front of her. "The Specter will die within 30 seconds, she said. "You have to consume the crystal before then." Then she threw it over to Nick, who looked at it. It was about the size of a finger and extremely durable. Nick pulled his head back and shoved the crystal down his throat. Swallowing wasn't easy, but he could deal with something like that. As soon as the Specter core entered Nick's neck, it suddenly started to get attracted by something in his throat and stopped. A moment later, Nick felt it moving toward the front of his throat. Ding! Then Nick's Zephyx synchronizer and the Specter core touched. Suddenly, the real world vanished from Nick's vision, and everything was covered in darkness. The last thing he saw were the three people looking at him with serious expressions. Darkness. Eternal darkness all around Nick. It was almost like he was back in the place where the nightmare stayed. Naturally, Nick knew what was happening. After all, he had learned everything there was to learn about the consumption. An instant later, something appeared in the darkness. Some dark clouds gathered together and took the form of a human body. In just a couple of moments, a completely new body formed. It was Nick. A second one. The second Nick looked identical to the first, with one exception. Its eyes looked gray and dead. Nick had a similar expression, but there was still humanity visible in his eyes. This was the difference between suppressing one's emotions and not having any to begin with. The second Nick looked at Nick. And then it approached. Nick also stepped forward. After some time, the two of them reached each other. Both extended their arms. Their palms met. They pushed. That was it. This was what it meant to go toe-to-toe with a Specter in a battle of wills. The images Nick was seeing were just reflections of how his mind and the Specter's mind interacted. The Specter core and the Zephyx synchronizer were already fighting each other. Nick focused with everything he had, pushing against the Specter. The Specter did the same. Time passed. They both kept pushing. More time passed. They kept pushing. It was more difficult for Nick to keep his focus. More time passed. Nick had the urge to lose consciousness. More time passed. Nick felt like he could only keep himself conscious by forcing it. Yet when he looked at the copy in front of him, he saw no difference. There was no exhaustion. There was no panic. There was no struggle. It was dead. It was just as dead as when it had appeared. Nick kept pushing. More time passed. Pain coursed through Nick's body. He felt like something inside his head was breaking. His head was killing him, and he felt like his eyes were moving back into his head without his control. He kept forcing his eyes forward, but he was fighting a losing battle. On the other side, his copy just kept pushing. CRK. Nick stabilized himself immediately after his hands were pushed back a slight bit. Just now, he had lost focus for 1 millisecond, and in that millisecond, his hands had been pushed back the slightest bit. The distance was almost unnoticeable. And yet, it was different from before. The front lines had moved. Nick continued holding against the Specter in his new position. However, no matter what he did, his new position would forever be behind the starting one. Under normal circumstances, in these kinds of battles, one only needed to keep pushing and wait for the enemy to make a mistake. But that was exactly what wouldn't happen here. The Specters were perfect. They did not make mistakes. They never made mistakes. They never relented. They never gave up. The two of them kept pushing. Meanwhile, the scribe was looking at an unconscious Nick. 4 weeks had already passed. Nick had been in a battle with the dark cloud for 4 weeks. That was already more than the scribe had anticipated. Most consumptions ended within a day or a couple of days. When someone consumed a mid-elder, the fight might drag on for over a week. Reports about consuming a late elder stated the fighting could continue for up to 4 weeks. The fact that Nick was still fighting a peak elder after 4 weeks meant he would have definitely succeeded against a late elder. This was somebody with the talent to become a peak protector or maybe even a shield. Sadly, Nick was too ambitious to continue living. Chapter 595, Backup Plan. More time passed. Nick kept pushing. By now, the Extractors had joined the room and watched Nick just like the scribe. They were entering unprecedented territory. The most anyone had ever survived against a peak elder was 6 weeks. That was the record. And today, Nick cracked it. The Extractors needed to make sure no accidents would occur. Nick just kept pushing against his copy. It looked like nothing had changed within the last 6 weeks. Except for one thing. Nick's hands had been pushed back 3 centimeters. That was not a lot, but these 3 centimeters were impossible to get back. Nick's hands hadn't been able to push forward even a micrometer for the past 6 weeks. The Specter was perfect. There were no mistakes. There were no openings. It was flawless. Nick had believed he could win against it. However, the last 6 weeks proved one thing. He was focused to an unreasonable and supernatural degree, but he was not flawless. He was not perfect. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been pushed back by 3 centimeters. The consumption was a battle of will, and it was impossible to further optimize such a battle. There were no tricks one could employ. Well, at least none that worked. There was one thing Nick could try. It was a backup plan he had come up with before starting his consumption. If this were only a battle of wills, Nick might not have had the confidence to attempt it. However, there was something about him that made him different from normal people, and if it came to it, he would use it. But the chances of success were low, and he would only use it if there was nothing left he could do. So he kept on pushing. The Extractors looked at Nick. 2 additional weeks had passed, and Nick was still just lying there. If Nick had lost, his body would give off human Zephyx and slowly begin transforming into the dark cloud. If he won, his body would give off Specter Zephyx and slowly wake up. If both of them died, Nick would just die. However, Nick was still alive, and he gave off no Zephyx at all. This meant he was still battling the Specter, which was unreal. It had been 8 weeks. 16 weeks is the theoretical maximum, the Extractress thought as she looked at Nick. No matter how much willpower you have, you will not be able to stop yourself from dying when 16 weeks have passed. The Extractress narrowed her eyes. That will also be when the Specter dies. Nick kept pushing. More time passed. The Specter just continued to stare at him with dead eyes. It didn't think about winning or about being in the lead. Its goal was not to win, but to not die. It felt no happiness, smugness, or excitement. It just kept pushing with perfect efficiency. And it would continue to do so until the very end. It was impossible for it to lose. More time passed. Nick had been looking at the Specter in front of him for 10 weeks. For 10 weeks, it hadn't made any mistakes or shown any weakness. It was like Nick was trying to push an immovable object. The pressure was mounting. Nick was desperately searching for a glimmer of hope, but there was none. Nick started to consider that he might lose. More time passed. It had been 12 weeks. Nick had already been pushed back half a meter. He was losing his concentration more and more frequently. Most of the time, his mind was in a state of complete confusion and delirium. He was forgetting himself, and the most horrifying part was that Nick knew this was not just a temporary effect. No, this was permanent. Nick's mind was straining so hard that he was suffering permanent brain damage. He was forgetting things, and he knew they would not return even if he won. This was the cost of sacrificing oneself. Nick's memories were burning away. Of course, the same thing was happening to the Specter. The only difference was that it didn't care about its memories. It only cared about not dying. Even if it lost 90% of its memories, it would continue pushing with perfect efficiency, since the will to survive was in its very core. Meanwhile, if Nick lost 90% of his memories, he would have long since collapsed, since he wouldn't even know who he was or what he was doing. Nick couldn't get through. He couldn't win. It was truly impossible. A peak expert could not win against a peak elder in a duel of wills. I can't win, Nick realized in a moment of clarity. I have to try my backup plan. At that moment, Nick was slowly being pushed back. That was because he was focusing on something else. He was focusing on his past. He was thinking about the image of the burning building. He was thinking about what had happened before then. What happened before he woke up in front of the burning building. Nick tried his best. The blackness around him transformed into images. His memories. In the real world, the Extractress noticed something starting to push out of Nick's throat. This was a sign that the Specter's core was winning the battle. She narrowed her eyes. The images around Nick morphed as the burning building came and went. Shadows appeared. Shadows vanished. Fire appeared around Nick. A little boy carried something in his hand. The little boy focused on the hallway. I met the null, Nick spoke, his eyes focused on his copy. I forgot everything about it. The Specter didn't react. It just kept pushing Nick backward very slowly. If I regain my memories, I will know what the null looks like, and you will know as well. I don't think the null cares whether you're a Specter. If you know anything about it, you will die. What will it be? Will we both die completely? Or are you willing to just lose part of yourself and survive? This was Nick's backup plan. If he managed to remember the null, it would come and kill both of them. Remembering the null represented a 100% chance at 100% death. Meanwhile, conceding to Nick would only be a 100% chance at 99% death. After all, part of the Specter would still survive. If one thought back to the minions of the Sea King, could one truly say that nothing of them had remained? They might not have had their souls and minds, but their bodies and abilities still persisted. Weren't bodies and abilities still part of oneself? Something like this would never work on a human. After all, they would feel so angry and hopeless that they would prefer both dying rather than giving the other side all the benefits. But Nick wasn't fighting a human. He was fighting a Specter. And Specters were very different. The images distorted more and more. The inside of the house seemed to change. Nick felt like something inside it was moving. There was something else inside the house. That could have only been the null. Nick's eyes narrowed, focused on his copy in front of him. Time is ticking, what's your choice? Nick asked. The Specter did not react. It just kept pushing. You will die if you continue, Nick shouted. I have already shown you my willpower. You think I wouldn't go through with committing suicide if that means ending your existence as well? In the end, I'm also just human, and I would much rather kill us both than let you continue living. The Specter looked at Nick. Nick knew for a fact that it understood him. They were not communicating via words. They were communicating via concepts and thoughts. Everything Nick had said registered in its mind. He was sure of it, yet it showed no reaction. None. It just kept pushing Nick backward. Nick became nervous. It wasn't giving up. It wasn't stopping. "Fine," Nick shouted. Then he focused on his past with all his power. The images surrounding him became clearer. Nick felt like he was back inside the house. He could feel it. There was something foreign inside. Something that shouldn't exist. The little child turned its head towards a hallway. It knew the thing would come from there. The child waited. And then, bang! The images broke into pieces around Nick, and his eyes widened. He quickly tried to resummon them. They reappeared, and he found himself inside the house again. Bang! The images exploded again. He tried again. Bang! Nick's eyes opened wide in horror. "I can't remember. It's impossible. No matter how hard I try, I can't remember the null. Everything always breaks apart before it appears." Nick looked with horror at the Specter in front of him, which just looked back with a neutral expression. Yes, Nick had been right. One option was a 100% chance of 100% death, while the other was a 100% chance of 99% death. A Specter would choose the second. Yet Nick had based his hypothesis on a faulty foundation. In truth, the first option was not a 100% chance of 100% death. It was actually a 90% chance of a 100% chance of 100% death. After all, there was a chance Nick might not be able to remember. The Specter had seen that, and it found these odds more in its favor than the other one. Chapter 596, The End. Nick's backup plan had failed. He couldn't intimidate the Specter into conceding, and he couldn't pull through with his threat either. Nick's mind became more chaotic as he tried to find a way out. Plans upon plans formed in his mind, but nothing would work. This was a direct battle. This was a human against a Specter. A Zephyx synchronizer against a Specter core. There was no scheme that could be pulled off in such a straightforward fight. The one with the weaker will would lose. And that was Nick. Nick would lose because he was human. There was nothing he could do about it. He kept pushing back, but nothing changed. The Specter just kept pushing emotionlessly. "What do I do?" Nick thought in panic. "What can I do? There's nothing I can do. But there has to be a way. There has to be a way out." Nick tried to come up with a plan, but none of them would change anything. Time passed. Nick fell into delirium more and more frequently, and he was being pushed back. By now, he had been pushed back 5 meters. 5 more meters, and he would hit the wall of his mind. That represented death. There was nothing he could do. Nick's mind just kept running in circles, creating the same plan hundreds of times before throwing it away. And then finally, he calmed down. It's over, he thought. It's truly over. Scenes of Nick's past materialized in the black world. Him waking up in the outer city before walking to the Dregs. His horrible life in the Dregs. His meeting with Albert. Meeting Wintour. Creating Dark Dream. Horua. There was this other boy Nick had killed, but he couldn't remember his name or why. These memories had already been burned away permanently. Jenny. That other colleague. Nick didn't remember what happened to him. Wasn't there also something about some small manufacturer? Wasn't that related to Wintour's family? Nick had had many employees, but he could only remember a couple of them. However, he did remember that he used to remember all of their names. The Crimson Sea. Nick still remembered everything about that incident. Wintour's death. Wintour's father. What was his name again? Cecil, Varon, he didn't remember. Julian, he remembered Julian. Whatever happened to Albert, did he die? The outside world. The ruins. The Sea King. Anatomy. The nightmare. Aegis. Arya, he regretted that he had wasted 5 of her years. The trainee program. His squad. And that was it. Nick's life. At least everything he still remembered. I caused a lot of suffering in my life. Nick thought as picture after picture of death and suffering shot through the dark world. But I was on my way to redemption, he thought as pictures of the happy people of Crimson City appeared. I was doing my best. Pictures of stress and pressure appeared and disappeared. Nick took a deep breath. The only thing where I didn't do my best was with Arya. Frankly, I didn't even try. I felt happiness in the possibility, but I never dared to try to make it real. I would do things differently if I had another shot. I would actually try. Maybe not for me, but for her. I might not deserve happiness on my path to redemption, but others do. The regret I feel is not my own lack of happiness, but her disappointment and pain. Was giving up and letting her go the right choice? Maybe fighting for her was what she wanted to see, since I have never done that before. Fighting? I fought for everything and everyone except for her. Yet, isn't the fight for the person you love the most important? If anybody is fighting for anything, it would be for their loved ones. Nick could feel the end approaching. As he became distracted more and more frequently, the Specter kept pushing him back. Even as Nick was about to die, the Specter still didn't make a mistake. Until the very end, it was perfect. Nick took a deep breath, and a feeling of acceptance and resolve rose inside him. He looked at the Specter in front of him with determination. I will die, but I refuse to let this Specter take over my body and get reborn. This might hurt Aegis since they will lose a peak elder, but for once in my life, I want to be selfish. I'm also just human. Nick roared and pushed against the Specter. The Extractress saw Nick's entire body cramping with strain. She knew what this meant. This was always what happened when a trainee was about to fail their consumption. Inside the dark world, Nick was pushing the Specter back. However, the Specter was still calm. At this moment, Nick was using 120% of his power. However, that used up a ridiculous amount of focus. Nick was essentially committing suicide. He pushed the Specter back to the original starting position. Yet, Nick had shortened his maximum survival time during the consumption by an entire week. Meanwhile, the Specter could still survive the full 16 weeks. It just needed to hold out. Nick kept pushing. The Specter was pushed back. 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters. Yet when they reached 5 meters, they stopped. It was like the Specter had suddenly turned into an impenetrable, immovable wall. Naturally, the Specter could match Nick's power output. It just hadn't done so until now, since it wanted Nick to use up his focus. Nick screamed and shouted. He tried to destroy the Specter. He tried to destroy it with absolutely everything he had. And yet it wouldn't move. It was just as powerful as him. He couldn't win. But I know that. I don't want to win. I want to die with it. The Extractress looked with a tragic expression at Nick's body, which was already seizing. Nick pushed. His Zephyx synchronizer pressed against the Specter crystal. The Specter crystal didn't move. CRK. Suddenly, Nick felt something inside him break. The Extractress sighed. Human Zephyx was coming out of Nick's body. Nick's shell had broken apart. The area between his Zephyx synchronizer and the Specter core was under so much pressure that his shell couldn't withstand it anymore. It broke and dispersed. It was over. Nick's Zephyx regeneration wouldn't be able to keep up with his usage anymore. Even if he managed to win against the Specter, he would die within the hour. Yet this didn't change anything for Nick. He was already dead. So he kept on pushing. He would keep pushing until his mind and body were damaged beyond repair. He would destroy everything he had to such an absolute degree that the Specter would have nothing left to rebuild itself with. We are going to die, Nick shouted at his copy. I will die first. And you will die next. CRK. A crack appeared inside Nick's Zephyx synchronizer. Yet it just kept pushing. I will not allow you to come back. I don't care if it was me that forced you into this duel. In the end, you are the one that will kill me, and I hate you for that. I don't give a shit if you are in the right or in the wrong. I hate you, and I will leave nothing for you. We are going to die here and now. CRK. More cracks appeared all over Nick's Zephyx synchronizer. The end is here, Nick spoke coldly. I will die a villain. I did not live long enough to see myself become a hero. Nick looked upward. Arya, I'm sorry. Then his eyes steeled, and he glared at the Specter. He pushed with everything he had. I don't intend to die with you, the copy spoke. You win. Bang. Suddenly, the copy stopped resisting, and the two of them broke past the border of the dark world. Crack! Suddenly, the middle of the Specter core became brittle, and Nick's Zephyx synchronizer broke through the walls. And then it entered the Specter core. Nick could not believe what was happening, and he looked around in complete confusion. What was happening? He wasn't dead. The Specter had given up. In a way. Nick looked to the side and saw a black cloud floating in the emptiness. I will continue to live on, it spoke. Part of me will forever continue to live inside of you. And maybe I can cause more suffering like this. Whoom! The black cloud shot forward and engulfed Nick. The Adductress couldn't believe what she was seeing. Human and Specter Zephyx were coming out of Nick. She had never heard of something like this happening. Meanwhile, inside Nick's neck, the crystal representing his Zephyx synchronizer started to spin again. And the Specter core surrounding it followed. Chapter 597, Not Natural. Nick's mind became chaotic. He thought about many different things without any logical connection. It was like being inside a fever dream. Colors moved back and forth and transformed into completely different concepts. Was he dying? Was he still alive? Was he dead? Everything became surreal to Nick. How fast was time passing? Was it even passing? From time to time, concepts and realizations entered Nick's mind. While his focus might have been completely scattered, his mind was still generating thoughts, trying to make sense of his new reality. The dark cloud. Why had it suddenly given up? Some part of Nick's mind realized it actually made sense. Everything returned to the first two possibilities. 100% chance at 100% death, or 100% chance at 99% death. But this time, these chances and numbers were actually accurate. The dark cloud had seen that Nick would have killed it. It had seen his undying will to kill himself together with it. He would have done so. There was no doubt about it. So the Specter had chosen the other option. When Nick thought about that, its last words shot through his mind. Part of it would forever continue to live on inside of him. Yet how long was forever in this case? Nick's shell was destroyed, and he should be losing Zephyx rapidly. There was no way for him to recover enough to keep his Zephosis going. The next moment, an image of his Zephyx synchronizer shot through his mind. Nick saw how it was embedded inside the bigger Specter core. The two of them had aligned with each other, and when the Zephyx synchronizer spun, the Zephyx core around it spun as well. Both had the same shape. Both were rhombuses. In a way, a Specter core and a Zephyx synchronizer were almost identical. A Zephyx synchronizer gave humans the power to control Zephyx and use it in many different ways. Wasn't a Specter core the same thing? Well, in a way. A Zephyx synchronizer was to a Specter core what a heart was to a body. A body included a heart, but there was much more. A Specter core could do what a Zephyx synchronizer could, but it also contained all of a Specter's soul, mind, and Zephyx. In short, it was much more advanced than a mere Zephyx synchronizer. There was also a fundamental difference between Specters and humans regarding their abilities. When an Extractor became more powerful, they attained new abilities that built upon their base ability. When a Specter became more powerful, it didn't necessarily gain new abilities. Most of the time, the one ability it had just grew more powerful or attained new facets. The Nightmare didn't have many different abilities. It could only create illusions. That was its only ability. For an unknown period of time, Nick looked at the two rotating rhombuses. They both belonged to him now. And yet, this was not how things were supposed to be. Usually, the Specter core would lose all the lines on its surface, which symbolized the Specter's abilities and personality, and it would orbit the Zephyx synchronizer. Normally, that orbit happened inside the shell. After a Specter was eliminated during the consumption, its core would pass through the barrier and start orbiting the Zephyx synchronizer inside the shell. The shell would pull in Zephyx, which would then flow into the Zephyx synchronizer. The Zephyx synchronizer would decide what would happen to the Zephyx and send it to the Specter core. The Specter core would do the actual work of transforming the Zephyx and send the result out of the barrier so it could be used by the Extractor. The Specter core could also use the Zephyx to create the abilities the Zephyx synchronizer had, since it would copy the synchronizer's lines. It would essentially become a more powerful copy of the Zephyx synchronizer. But this was not what would happen to Nick. First, his barrier was broken. Second, his Zephyx synchronizer was inside the Specter core. Third, the lines on the Specter core were still there. This Specter core was not a clean slate, which was how it was supposed to be. Nick had no idea how things would continue from here, assuming he managed to somehow survive the lack of Zephyx. Absent-mindedly, Nick kept looking at the picture of the Specter core surrounding his Zephyx synchronizer. He looked at it for a long time. Slowly, the Specter core was repairing itself, encompassing his Zephyx synchronizer more and more. Nick watched as the hole closed. The smaller it became, the colder he started to feel. And one day, the hole closed fully. Now, Nick's Zephyx synchronizer no longer showed at all. As soon as the last bit of it vanished, Nick felt like he'd been thrown into a pool of ice water. Everything around him started to feel cold. That was such an alien feeling. Nick hadn't felt cold for decades. But now he felt like he was freezing. Was this the feeling of running out of Zephyx? People felt cold when they were starving, right? Was this something similar? He waited, and waited, and waited. And yet he didn't die, and the coldness didn't seem to expand or grow more extreme. In fact, Nick's mind became clearer as time passed, and he seemed to regain some of his wits. He just kept watching the Specter core. He knew a lot about spectrology, and he'd also learned quite a bit about zephology. So he could somewhat tell what was happening. But when he actually tried to think about how this fusion was supposed to work, he drew a blank. I am definitely still alive and I won't die to this. That much is certain, Nick thought as he looked at the image. The Specter core is absorbing enough Zephyx to keep my Zephosis running, even without a shell. Now that I think about it, it actually makes sense. Specter cores are far superior to Zephyx synchronizers. A Specter doesn't need a shell to survive, and they don't use any less Zephyx than humans. Specter cores naturally pull in more Zephyx than Zephyx synchronizers, even if the Zephyx synchronizers have shells. Additionally, since the Specter core also contains all the Zephyx of a Specter, my Zephyx synchronizer should have access to all my Zephyx in its immediate surroundings, assuming the Specter core stores all the Zephyx inside my body. Nick's brows furrowed. However, how will my abilities work? There are manipulation lines on the Specter core, and while pure Zephyx can travel through them without being changed, Zephyx in the form of an ability can't. I can pull Zephyx to and from my Zephyx synchronizer, but if I want to use any of my abilities, they won't be able to get through the Specter core. Do I still have access to my abilities? Yet this wasn't the only issue Nick foresaw. And how will my level grow in the future? My Zephyx synchronizer absorbs Zephyx created by a Specter to advance in level, but Specters only create Zephyx under specific conditions. Even worse, the Zephyx created from Specters can't be used on Specters unless it's the Crimson Sea using it. So, if I were to work with a Specter, its Zephyx should theoretically not be able to reach my Zephyx synchronizer, since my new Specter core is isolating it. More and more problems appeared in Nick's mind. It was very clear this was not a natural evolution of power. This was the result of an experiment. So many problems. An unknown period of time later, Nick saw the Specter core fully reform. His Zephyx synchronizer and Specter core had recovered. Shortly after, his mind started to hurt. Then his body started to hurt. Nick put his hand to his head and gritted his teeth. He squinted as the world around him transformed. Everything became heavier and more oppressive. He was being pulled somewhere. Nick's abdomen started to strain, and he felt his torso moving. Oh, look who's finally up. Nick slowly opened his eyes and was blinded by the bright light around him. He massaged his head and tried to get used to moving again. His mind was in chaos, but it was calming down with remarkable speed. Nick still felt like he was freezing. After a bit, he looked around. He was inside a bed, in the middle of a big hall filled with different devices. Nick could only recognize what about 30% of them did. He also saw someone standing beside his bed. It was the technician, looking at Nick with a grin. "Welcome back to the world of the living, Nick," he said. Then he took out some kind of device. "Are you ready to unearth the secrets of your new body?" Chapter 598, New Body. "Very interesting," the technician commented as he looked at a display on his barrier. The display showed a person's vital signs. Their blood pressure was elevated, and their heart rate was almost 150 beats per minute. All of these little nuggets of information were cool and all, but one didn't need to see any of this to know what was actually going on. Nick looked at a tall, muscular man. The man was breathing rapidly, cold sweat running down his entire body. His muscles were strained and his eyes were fixed on Nick. He was having an intense fight-or-flight response. His body would obviously choose flight, but the door behind him was closed. Hey, the man shouted casually with a nervous smile. What's up? Naturally, he was trying to dispel the awkwardness of Nick, just emotionlessly looking at him. You also from these parts? He asked. The technician observed further deterioration of the man's mental state, but chalked it up to Nick's ability to highlight an awkward atmosphere simply by being silent and unreactive. After a while, the technician nodded, and a moment later, the door behind the man opened. The man almost jumped away in fear at the noise. Oh hey, I think that means I should leave. Okay, bye, he said, quickly stepping through the door. He walked briskly to the exit of the research area and left. I think that's enough for now, Nick heard the technician's voice inside his head. You really scared every single one of them just by standing there. Nick sighed. I'm genuinely not trying to scare them, he said helplessly. I could tell, the technician said with a laugh. But no matter what you do, every normal human will perceive your actions as threatening. Nick looked to the side, lost. There's really no doubt anymore, he asked. Nah, that pretty much sealed it, the technician said. You're 48 for 50. You scared almost everyone just by making different faces. Nick tried to come to terms with his new reality. The technician had put him through many experiments over the past few days to learn everything they could about his new circumstances. Nick even felt a bit guilty that a shield was wasting all this time on him, but the technician said this was way more important than anything else. This concerned humanity's future. At least that's what he said with an excited grin. Their most recent experiment tried to find out how Nick's new state of being affected other people in his vicinity. To test this, they had brought in many different normal humans. Initially, Nick was just supposed to stand there and do nothing. Yet every single time, the person in front of him got a fight-or-flight response and became very scared. When asked about their thoughts while standing in front of Nick, all of them reported feeling like he was filled with unending hatred and about to attack any second. He felt very, very dangerous to them. Naturally, the technician had been present during all of this and could tell Nick was just relaxed and normal. After that, Nick turned around for the next couple of people. They only saw his back, but they still felt afraid of him. They were terrified he would turn around and they would see something horrifying. Then Nick started smiling and introducing himself as soon as people entered. Nick had gone through many meetings in his life and was very good at appearing charismatic and friendly. 8 of the 10 people still felt scared. The last 2 weren't scared, but felt like they couldn't possibly trust Nick. They felt like everything he said was a lie. No matter what Nick did, all his actions were interpreted in the most hostile way possible. And sadly, that made sense. Since the Specter core surrounded Nick's Zephyx synchronizer, every bit of Zephyx that came out of it was Specter Zephyx, not human. This meant Nick essentially had the aura of a Specter, and humans were instinctively terrified of Specters. Specters were their natural enemies. Naturally, Nick was still human. He could still feel things, albeit in a dampened way. This was another thing that had changed. Even normal people had a slight bit of prefix in Zephyx traveling through their bodies, but the amount was so minuscule it counted as basically nothing. However, this little bit still made a difference. Being around a Specter naturally made someone feel nervous and antsy. Even Extractors felt that. They were just used to it and could deal with the anxiety. It was human nature to be wary of Specters. So what about Nick? He wasn't any different. He also felt some anxiety while being around Specters. But the issue was that Specter Zephyx was continually traveling throughout his body. This meant Nick's subconscious constantly felt like a Specter was inside or surrounding him. Nick consciously and logically knew this wasn't the case, but his emotions didn't care. They would continue feeling antsy and anxious. And that made it more difficult for Nick to feel other emotions. His emotional pipeline was constantly occupied with housing anxiety, leaving less space for everything else. That left less room for any kind of emotion, including negative ones. Usually, one would think panic, stress, rage, and sadness would be amplified and easier to feel in such a state, but that wasn't the case. This wasn't the normal kind of anxiety. This was anxiety born from being close to a Specter. His mind and body were in a constant survival mode. This created an urgent and icy calm inside Nick. The Specter Zephyx was also what made him feel like he was freezing all the time. Nick's Zephyx synchronizer wasn't surrounded and bathed by the warm and welcoming prefix of the atmosphere, but by the cold and icy Zephyx of a Specter. However, Nick wasn't entirely sure if he was happy with this or not. On the one hand, he felt very unnatural and thought he should really fix this state, since humans weren't supposed to be this way. But on the other hand, his guilt was no longer as overbearing as before, clouded by the new anxiety. It was not worse or better. It was different. Yet that wasn't all that was different. There was also a big difference in his powers and how they developed. A positive aspect was that Nick's Zephyx regeneration was even faster than before. Additionally, he could become a specialist and was ready to advance at any time. There was another positive aspect, but it would remain a negative for a couple of years. Due to the manipulation lines on the Specter core, Nick couldn't properly use his abilities right now, weakening him considerably. However, the technician was already developing a way to alter the manipulation lines. Or more precisely, working on a method to alter them. The technician wouldn't be able to alter them himself, but his technique would give Nick a way to. He had been working on this technique for centuries already, and it was nowhere near complete. However, he was planning to give Nick a prototype version to try out. It would be much easier for the owner of the Specter core to change the lines. If everything worked out as expected, Nick would be able to reshape the manipulation lines to not only restore but augment his previous abilities. If shaped correctly, Nick's Specter core would work as an amplifier for the unique Zephyx coming out of his Zephyx synchronizer. That was only possible by having a Zephyx synchronizer inside a Specter core. Nick was already focusing on learning more about spectrology, biology, and Zephyx manipulation. He would need to know a lot about these topics if he wanted to reshape the manipulation lines of his Specter core. Yet there was one last difference, and Nick wasn't a fan of it at all. It concerned his future advancement in level. Just as expected, Nick's Specter core didn't allow Zephyx from foreign Specters to pass through, which meant his Zephyx synchronizer couldn't advance. However, since it produced its own Specter Zephyx, his Zephyx synchronizer could absorb that. But how did his Specter core produce Zephyx? After a lot of experimenting, the technician and Nick found out how. Nick was producing Specter Zephyx constantly, but production was much higher during the day. In the late hours, it fell by quite a bit. The reason was that humans were generally asleep during those hours. Nick produced Zephyx like a Specter now, and his way of producing it was to make humans suffer. The more they suffered, and the more powerful the suffering person, the more Zephyx Nick produced. That was not easy for Nick to accept. Chapter 599, Suffering and Help. This new change was the hardest thing Nick had to get used to. His goal was to redeem himself by improving the lives of as many people as possible. For that, he needed to be powerful. Someone without power couldn't change a lot. Yet to become powerful, Nick needed to make people suffer. It was ironic. It was almost like some all-powerful being was playing a joke on him. "All right, I'm done with experiments for now," the technician said. Nick nodded absent-mindedly and walked out of the experiment room. "You can go back to learning if you want. I'll call you when I need you," the technician added. Nick nodded again and started leaving. While the technician compiled data, Nick walked through the corridors until he arrived in front of a door. He entered and found himself in an absolutely gigantic library. This was the Great Library, the greatest repository of knowledge in the world. It was 100 meters wide, 200 meters long, and about 100 meters high. Everything was covered in shelves, and there were even books sitting outside them since there was no more space. There were probably millions of books here. Even more shocking, almost none of them were fiction. Fictional stories were not deemed important enough to be stored here, unless they were absolutely amazing or taught valuable things. Nick absent-mindedly walked up some stairs and stopped at a random place. Then he grabbed a book and read. It described in detail how the pancreas created enzymes and what they were good for. The book was quite heavy since every leaf of paper was encased in glass. This was due to the age of the book. It was written by the ancient ones. Naturally, Nick had to learn the language called English first to understand it, but that didn't take long. Sadly, just a couple of minutes into reading, Nick slowed down and felt his mind wander. I have to inflict suffering to grow, he thought as he read the same sentence for the 5th time. How can I redeem myself like this? Will my future be a balancing act between helping people and damaging them? Nick sighed. I shouldn't jump to conclusions. The technician is still running a couple of experiments on this. We don't know exactly how it works yet. Nick closed his eyes for a second before reopening them with newfound focus. Then he actually started learning. After about 2 days, he was called back in for more experiments. This time a hero was sent in. The hero walked in with his head lowered. I am here to shorten my sentence, he spoke with shame. The hero had deep blue hair and seemed quite young. He wore the outfit of a governor, but Nick already knew what this was about. 1 hour for 1 year, Nick said. Naturally, Nick had been briefed by the technician about what he should do. He had done this rarely, but a couple of times. Additionally, he had also been on the receiving end of this act several times. I understand, the man said as he slowly lifted his head to look at Nick. When he saw him, his heart started to race. The hero wore a special Zephyx suppressor that locked his Zephyx, but still allowed his Zephosis to work. Like this, he couldn't hurt any expert, but he could still survive. Naturally, this was one of the corrupt governors sentenced to stand in front of Aegis entrance as punishment. Nick had no pity for such people. Corruption was one of the things he hated most. Of course, when the hero saw Nick in his weakened state, he was sent into a fight-or-flight response. However, as a very experienced extractor, he could deal with the situation without doing anything stupid. Lay on this table, Nick said, gesturing to a cold metallic table with straps on it. The man took a deep breath and walked over, his fear increasing. He was not looking forward to this. Naturally, the obvious happened, and Nick strapped him to the table. The guy couldn't move anymore. 1 hour, Nick repeated. I will stop as soon as 1 hour passes. You have to survive that long. I understand, the man said with anxiety. Just do it. All right, Nick said. Then he unsheathed his blade and put it under the nail of the man's big toe. 1 hour starting now. CRRKSH. The man gritted his teeth as the blade entered the space between his big toe and its nail. Nick moved it around a bit until the nail fell off. Naturally, the blade had completely severed it. In less than 10 seconds, the nail had already regrown. The hero's regenerative abilities weren't suppressed. Next, Nick skinned the man's soles. The man's eyes bulged in pain, but he didn't shout. This was the deal. 1 hour of torture in exchange for 1 year off his sentence. Obviously, something like this hadn't existed before Nick woke up from his slumber. It had only been created because the technician needed somebody he could experiment on without any moral issues. In the technician's mind, this experiment should give valuable insight into how exactly Nick produced Zephyx. After warming up for a minute with footwork, Nick moved up the body and started punching the man's abdomen repeatedly. Naturally, if Nick used all his power, the guy's body would explode. So he was careful to inflict wounds only fatal to normal people, not extractors. Internal bleeding was really bad for normal people, but extractors would survive it rather easily. Yet it still hurt like hell. Nick essentially made the guy's liver explode over and over as his kidneys got squashed and his intestines ruptured. After less than a minute, the guy had already started screaming in pain, but he wasn't asking Nick to stop. Not that Nick would stop. At this moment, he was producing a good amount of Zephyx. Torturing a hero for an hour a day would give Nick enough Zephyx for the day. However, Nick actually didn't need Zephyx. He could become an initial specialist any second if he wanted to, and as long as he didn't advance, all this Zephyx would be wasted. But that wasn't the purpose of this torture anyway. They wanted to find out how much Zephyx Nick could produce and how it worked exactly. After around 10 minutes of destroying the hero's abdomen, Nick started harvesting ribs. He tore them out, threw them aside, waited for new ones to grow, and repeated the process. 30 minutes into the torture, the guy started begging to get out. You're not getting out, Nick said. I'm doing this for your sake. In 30 minutes, you're going to thank me. You don't want all of this to be for nothing, right? Nick spoke these words coldly, and his torture didn't stop for a bit. Eventually, Nick got to the guy's teeth and worked on them a little. The more pain the hero felt, the more Zephyx Nick produced. For the remaining minutes, Nick tortured him with random injuries. And then 60 minutes were over. We're done, Nick said. The man was breathing heavily, a sea of horror in his eyes. Nick calmly opened the straps, and the man quickly sat up. "So," Nick asked, "would you have wanted me to stop 30 minutes for nothing or 60 minutes for a full year off your sentence?" The man didn't answer for a while. Then he looked at Nick with furrowed brows. "You created Zephyx," he said. "You're a Specter." "I'm not," Nick answered coldly. "The technician is watching us right now. He wouldn't let a Specter roam around freely." The man frowned. Sure, Nick felt like a Specter to him, but the way he acted was definitely human. "But you produced Zephyx, I'm sure of that," the man said. "Do you think it wise to ask these questions?" Nick asked evenly. The man's heart shook. "Forget I said anything," he said. Then he stood up and took a deep breath. "You're right," he said, looking at Nick with some relief. "It was worth the 60 minutes. Yes, these 60 minutes were horrible, but it saved me an entire year." "Thank you," he said. "You can leave," Nick said, gesturing to the door. "Keep in mind that all of this is confidential." "I understand," the man said. Then he left. After he left, Nick looked at the door. His eyes had regained their conviction. "Those were some good results, eh?" The technician's voice appeared in Nick's mind. Nick nodded. Nick had produced a lot of Zephyx while the man suffered, but even though he'd done something the man actually wanted and even thanked him for, none of the Zephyx vanished. This proved it was much easier for Nick to produce Zephyx than anticipated. Helping people did not cancel out the suffering created. If Nick made one person suffer and helped one person, the Zephyx produced would be the same as if he made one person suffer and helped 1,000. Only the amount of suffering mattered for Zephyx production. At least that was the prime hypothesis right now. A bit more testing would be required. Chapter 600, Report. Over the next 2 weeks, the technician made Nick go through a couple more experiments, and in the end they came to a conclusion. Yes, doing good did not interfere with the Zephyx produced by causing suffering. Even when it happened at the same time, it didn't interfere. If, for example, Nick were a medical professional dealing with serious injuries to save someone's life, he would still produce Zephyx if the process was quite painful. Naturally, Nick would be saving someone's life, and the patient would be grateful the entire time. Yet they would have still suffered, and Nick's Specter core would have still produced Zephyx. After learning all of this, Nick felt relieved. He had believed he wouldn't be able to help humanity anymore in his new state, but that wasn't true at all. Sure, there were still some issues, but this had been the biggest one, and it was solved. The technician and Nick had already come up with some plans about how Nick could produce enough Zephyx to keep advancing. However, they were still nowhere near done experimenting on Nick. While this issue had been dealt with, 2 others still needed solving. First, Nick needed to regain access to his abilities. Second, they didn't know how Nick's advancement between levels worked. How would he gain new abilities? Usually, an Extractor's Zephyx synchronizer, when the Extractor was ready to advance, entered a volatile state, and the Extractor could will it to copy the closest Specter's ability. But the closest Specter to Nick's Zephyx synchronizer was his own Specter core. Any outside Zephyx from another Specter couldn't enter the Specter core, meaning it couldn't touch Nick's Zephyx synchronizer. So how was it supposed to gain new abilities? Right now it seemed impossible. However, there was always a way, and Nick had the support of the most intelligent and oldest researcher in the world, the technician. The technician hadn't been this invested in a project for over 1,000 years. Depending on the result, this might transform all of humanity. The technician gave Nick all of his attention. By now, Nick had gotten used to him, and the two talked quite casually. The technician also wasn't someone who constantly demanded respect. One day, during a seemingly random experiment, the technician suddenly started frowning. Nick raised an eyebrow as the technician pulled the wires from his body with annoyance. "We gotta go," he said, walking to the door. "What's up?" Nick asked, standing up from the table. "Helia has been a pain in my ass for a month now," the technician said, leading Nick up the stairs. "She wants to know about the cities and several other research projects, and she's constantly complaining about their progress." Naturally, the shields talked to each other via voice transmission. Nick hadn't noticed it, but the technician had probably been talking with the left arm quite regularly. But then why isn't he just explaining everything? Nick thought with furrowed brows. "Because we don't talk often," the technician answered, as if he'd just read Nick's mind. Nick used to be surprised whenever the technician did this, but after a while, he got used to it. A researcher who had lived over 1,000 years had talked to so many people. with such a fast mind, that he could often guess with real accuracy what someone was thinking based on their expression and context clues. She only contacts me when she needs something, and I don't want to waste my time giving her useless reports, the technician explained as the two approached the central extractor shaft. She keeps supervising me like I'm some kind of baby. He might not read minds word for word, but he could guess roughly what was going on in someone's head most of the time. The two jumped into the extractor shaft and moved upward. "Why are we here exactly?" Nick asked. The technician jumped through one of the doors of the shaft. "I'll just introduce you and go over all the possibilities now, so we don't have to do this again," he said, opening the door to the Hall of Remembrance. Nick furrowed his brows, but before he could ask. "Not a lot," the technician answered. "I was very vague." Nick's eyebrows rose. The technician turned around and pointed his finger at Nick with an annoyed expression. "Shut it." Nick just looked at him with a neutral expression. Finally, the technician sighed and rubbed the side of his head in annoyance. Yes, I get it. I know. Then he groaned in frustration before approaching the left arm's office. Sadly, Nick couldn't stop his thoughts from occurring. If you were more dutiful in reporting, she wouldn't constantly ask for one. The technician didn't react. He already knew all of that. But it was just so annoying. He just wanted to focus on his research and his work. Couldn't everyone just leave him alone so he could create new technologies and advancements in peace? Nick knew these kinds of people well. They were amazing at what they did, but very often not very dutiful when it came to seemingly unnecessary things. Stuff like finances, marketing, legality, popularity, procedure, and so on. Naturally, due to their high intellect, they often noticed when these things occurred and knew about these flaws of theirs very well. But it just wasn't important enough to waste a lot of focus on. The technician opened the door to the left arm's office without knocking and entered. Nick carefully followed. When he saw the intimidating left arm standing in the middle of the dim office, Nick bowed respectfully. "Greetings, left arm," he said. As always, the left arm had an expression that made it seem as if she were looking at a criminal. "James," she said in her cold voice, looking at the technician, "please tell me why this is so important." "Just look at him," James said, gesturing to Nick. "He has a working Specter core surrounding his Zephyx synchronizer." "I see that," the left arm said flatly. "Yes, that is indeed very interesting, but I don't see how this is taking up your time to such a degree that 3 agent promotions and 15 city bankruptcies are still waiting. The future agents and the cities are waiting for you, and the procedures can't continue without your approval." The technician rolled his eyes in exasperation. "Don't you see how big this is? These little things are nothing compared to what might be in front of." "Might," the left arm interjected coldly. "That is the right word, might. It is not certain." She narrowed her eyes as she glared at the technician. Even if this guy were the future savior of humanity, he wouldn't be able to solve anything within the next couple of decades, and if you continue ignoring your duties, Aegis might not exist after the next couple of decades. Manage your things and do your duty so Aegis can run smoothly until your hope has a chance of paying off. We have to be alive to experience the fruits of hope. The technician grimaced. In a way, he looked like a toddler who didn't want to eat his veggie cubes. "Can't somebody else deal with this stuff?" he asked, his voice devoid of hope. The left arm just looked at him with an icy glare. "No," she said slowly. The technician slowly took a deep breath. Then his barrier activated, and several pictures flashed on it before vanishing. 5 seconds later, the barrier deactivated. "Okay, done," he said. "Can I go back to researching now?" Nick rolled his eyes. 5 seconds, he thought. This guy made all this trouble for just 5 seconds of work. Walking to the ground floor already took more than 5 seconds. However, Nick wasn't surprised. Many of these kinds of people were quite eccentric. "Tell me everything you found out about this new possible way of consumption," the left arm ordered. "Oh, sure," the technician answered, his mood immediately improving. As soon as he got to talk about his research, his demeanor started to glow like a child who just found a new toy. The technician talked endlessly about what he'd learned and what he thought would happen. "What about the best possible scenario?" the left arm asked, interrupting him. "Well," the technician said, "if we somehow manage to let the Zephyx synchronizer attain new abilities, we would technically not be limited by the power of the Specters we possess. Nick could potentially become a peak shield, and if everything goes well, he could even be the first human to reach the 9th level." Chapter 601, ability experiments. This was why the technician was so invested in this new development. The entire reason humanity couldn't properly fight the Specters was that training a shield was extremely difficult. If the current shields could become peak shields, things would be very different from how they currently were. For one, they wouldn't need to keep 3 of them in the same place. They also wouldn't need to endanger a huge number of people every single time they worked with the one adversary they had in custody. If the technician somehow found a way for Nick to keep advancing, all of humanity might transform. They might finally have a way to equally fight the Specters. However, all of this was just potential. Right now, it was not a certainty. Additionally, it was important that all of this remained secret. But we need to survive until then first, the left arm spoke. So, I need you to keep fulfilling your daily duties. Yes, yes, the technician answered dismissively. It was quite obvious he would once again follow this order for only a limited time. Try to find a way to advance. If you do, tell me, the left arm said before frowning. We might need to wake the champion again. Of course, the technician answered with an excited smile. Finally, all this unnecessary stuff was over, and he could go back to experimenting. Come, Nick, knowledge awaits, the technician shouted with excitement. Nick bowed quickly in front of the left arm and walked after him. The left arm watched Nick leave. There was another aspect of this entire thing that she noticed but didn't voice. At least not in front of Nick. And that was the mental effects of this transformation. Due to the way Zephyx worked inside Nick right now, one could argue he was partially a Specter now. He could be a half-Specter in a way. This meant it was also possible Nick could join the Specters instead of humanity, and that was an important thing to consider. If they invested everything into one human just for that human to help the Specters in the end, humanity might be doomed. Could they create a powerful being, and if they could, would that being help humanity or the Specters? This was an important aspect. This was a real danger. After all, Nick had told the technician about the Specter Zephyx inside his body and how it dampened his emotions. While Nick would definitely remain human in the short term, in the long term he might change into a Specter, mentally speaking. The technician and Nick continued experimenting. During this time, Nick kept learning more about biology, zephology, and Zephyx manipulation. Time passed. After a while, the two of them focused solely on how Nick's Specter core worked. Having a human with a Specter core gave one advancement after the next in the field. In just 1 year, research into Specter cores had progressed the equivalent of 50 years without Nick. After 2 years of research, the technician managed to create a prototype that could let someone change the manipulation lines of their Specter core. But that was when the research became dangerous. From now on, they had to test things. And since there was only Nick's first task was to map out every possible feeling the Specter core gave him. He could not perfectly see his Specter core. Sure, he could see the surface, but not the lines within the core. He could only feel how the Zephyx changed after passing through it. This meant that, as soon as they changed the manipulation lines, Nick wouldn't know what to change to regain the current form of his Specter crystal. He could only judge the result by remembering how it felt and trying things out to recreate it. Nick could potentially kill himself by removing or adding an incorrect manipulation line. For example, what if he somehow isolated the connection between his Zephyx synchronizer and the Specter core? That would result in his Zephyx synchronizer being surrounded by an impenetrable wall. It would be like an insect inside glass. Alternatively, a burst of poisonous Zephyx could cripple or destroy his Zephyx synchronizer. They had to proceed with utmost care. Luckily, Nick had had almost 2 years to fully remember how his Specter core felt. He was quite confident in being able to recreate the original. Finally, it was time to actually experiment. The first thing they tried was deleting some manipulation lines. Maybe they could turn it into a blank slate. Yet they realized very quickly this wouldn't work. After trying around a bit, Nick's Specter core stopped producing Zephyx, and his Zephyx synchronizer stopped receiving it in turn. They immediately changed it back. If they hadn't, Nick would essentially suffocate. That made it clear. The Specter core was required to remain a functional Specter core, since it was the only energy source for the Zephyx synchronizer. Turning it into a blank slate would kill Nick. Next, they tried restoring the Specter core's old ability. After all, the Dark Cloud had been a Specter, and like any other Specter, it had an ability. Sadly, they had to cut that experiment short after just a couple of days. The core of the Specter core was distorted and essentially destroyed, since Nick's Zephyx synchronizer was inside it now. Reverse engineering the ability without changing the manipulation lines on Nick's Zephyx synchronizer would take decades, if not centuries, of dedicated research. It was too difficult, and the results couldn't be applied to any potential new recruit, since every ability was unique. So they tried the next best thing. Was it possible to let Nick's abilities be used without the Specter core interfering with them? No. The Specter core always interfered with them and distorted them. For example, when Nick tried to blind everyone around him, only a small white cloud came out of his body that barely illuminated anything and cost over 50% of his Zephyx. When Nick tried to influence somebody's mind with illusions, some black mist would leave him and fly over to the target before dispersing harmlessly. Naturally, that also cost a huge amount of Zephyx. Nick didn't even attempt to turn into mist. If anything went wrong there, one could probably find his body pieces scattered across the entire room. Nick's abilities and the Dark Cloud's abilities interacted with each other, creating a useless mix. This left only one last option. They had to transform the Specter core, so it changed Nick's abilities without weakening them. And while they were at it, they might as well shoot for an amplification effect. So they started trying. Nick's ability to release a burst of light was the first they focused on, since it was the easiest to test and a comparatively simple ability. They experimented for an entire year, trying different things. The result? Surprisingly great. "Show me," the technician said with a smirk. Nick narrowed his eyes. The next instant, around 100 tiny wisps of mist popped out of his body. Whoom! The wisps exploded into bright light, just as powerful as Nick's ability would have been without the Specter core. The wisps also vanished immediately after giving off the light, since their Zephyx had been converted into blinding light. This essentially meant Nick had regained his light ability without making it worse. "All right, use the other variant," the technician ordered. Next, Nick held out his right hand, and a cloud of mist gathered on top of it. A moment later, the cloud started to give off a gentle light. Then it floated higher and stopped above Nick's head. Next, Nick walked around the room, and the cloud followed, still giving off a gentle light. When the technician saw that, he couldn't help smiling victoriously. This was not a new ability. This was simply another way of using Nick's old one. They hadn't been able to decouple the mist ability. So they had simply accepted it and included it in the way Nick used his ability. After experimenting further, they had also found a way to change the output. This essentially gave Nick an additional ability that let him illuminate his surroundings for a long time without using much Zephyx. Naturally, for Nick himself, this wasn't very useful, but it would help keep his immunity to darkness hidden. Additionally, it gave Nick an easy way to escort others through dark areas. After seeing this success, they grew excited to experiment with Nick's other abilities. And they quickly got more surprising and positive results. This new way of consuming a Specter appeared better and better as time passed. Chapter 602, Domain of Nightmare. The next ability they experimented on was Nick's most recent one, the one he had received from the Nightmare. Naturally, the technician knew all about Nick's run-in with the Nightmare, which made this much easier since Nick didn't need to keep that part secret. There were essentially two parts Nick had to keep secret about his ability. The fact that it came from the Null, and that he knew where the Nightmare was. The other two abilities were not so critical. While the technician and the left arm knew about Nick's run-in with the Nightmare, they didn't know about his run-in with the Null. They also didn't ask, since the Champion of Light had said Nick didn't need to tell them. The reason they were experimenting with the Nightmare's ability first was that it was the least dangerous one in case anything went wrong. If something went wrong while using this ability, Nick might lose a lot of Zephyx or damage something, but if something went wrong while transforming into mist, Nick might die. This time, it became much easier to make the ability functional again, since they'd already gained quite a bit of experience changing Nick's light ability. It barely took them 6 months to develop a functioning model for the first aspect of the ability, and only 4 months for the second. One had to remember that Nick's fourth ability technically had two aspects: immunity to darkness and control over someone's perception, as long as they didn't perceive him. And now, both had changed after going through the altered Specter core. Is the first variant still working? the technician asked. "I'll check," Nick said. They had just changed the manipulation lines for Nick's ability to alter someone's perception, and the technician wanted to know if the other part still worked. The room the two were in was split in two. One part was the normal, brightly lit room. The other was covered in black cloth that isolated the walls from all light, creating a dark chamber. Nick walked from the lit room into the dark chamber. As he passed the curtains and entered the darkness, something happened. Nick's body seemed to become ethereal. It was almost like he was vanishing. And that was kind of what was happening. Nick hadn't gained an additional function of his old ability. Instead, the old ability had been upgraded. In the past, he was simply immune to the effects of the nightmare, and his mist form turned into black smoke. Now Nick's body became transparent and ethereal. It was almost like he was becoming part of the background. Like he was becoming one with the darkness. If a person passed by his location, they wouldn't notice him unless they specifically knew what to look for and searched the darkness thoroughly. Nick could be centimeters from someone passing through the darkness, and they wouldn't notice him. Even more, his new ethereal form made it far easier for him to move. His body basically had no weight, and he could walk through the air because of that. Yes, technically, Nick could fly, but he had to be surrounded by darkness. Sadly, if someone noticed or sensed him, all of this would vanish, and his body would become solid again. Nevertheless, this was definitely a big upgrade. "Is it working?" the technician asked, deliberately not looking at Nick. He wasn't quite sure how Nick's ability worked, but Nick had told him it was extremely important that no one learn about his main ability. And since the Champion of Light had also said they didn't need to know it, the technician accepted these circumstances and just looked away whenever Nick told him to. "It works fine," Nick said from the darkness. The technician looked over and spotted Nick instantly. Nick looked just like always. The technician could only sigh. Sure, Nick had to keep his ability secret, but couldn't he just show the technician after it was already working? Naturally, the technician had asked Nick to show him a bit more before, but Nick was extremely adamant that this would not happen. In the end, the technician had to accept it. "Good," he said. "Now let's try the new one. You ready?" The technician looked away again, and Nick turned ethereal on his own. Of course, he could always turn solid again. He just needed to will it. A couple of seconds later, a person entered the room. It was a female bailiff. She had brown hair and looked to be in her early 30s. Nick could tell this was one of the bailiffs who had joined Aegis by having a family member already working there. Most normal bailiffs were family members of agents or protectors living in Aegis headquarters. As for how Nick knew that was most likely her background, she moved uncertainly and inexperienced. It was obvious she didn't have much battle experience, which wouldn't be the case if she joined via the trainee program. After entering, the woman approached the darkness. The technician was probably giving her instructions in her mind. Nick watched her nervously approach. Naturally, walking into the darkness was terrifying for everyone. Over 99% of humans were deathly afraid of approaching it. Of course, that wasn't surprising, since anyone who'd entered the darkness before had probably experienced one of the most terrifying things imaginable. No one wanted a repeat of something like that. The woman took a deep breath as she stopped in front of the darkness. For some seconds, she tried to amp herself up. She only had to go in, wait a bit, and leave. Then she would get some amazing references and advance her career. She would even earn a hefty bonus. Just enter the darkness. Come on, it's not that hard. Just a couple of seconds. The woman took several deep breaths. Then she stepped inside. As soon as she did, her vision began to swim. Immediately after, terrifying visages filled with hatred shot towards her. They wanted to consume her. She braced herself. But then the visages suddenly went past her, avoiding her. In shock, she looked at the terrifying illusions around her. Yet there was no pain. Was this some kind of other illusion? The nightmare didn't only use illusions of torture. Sometimes, it also subtly changed someone's perception to make them commit a dangerous mistake. While the woman nervously looked forward, Nick's eyes focused on her. He was losing a lot of Zephyx at this moment. As soon as she'd entered, Nick had felt a terrifying force enter her. Naturally, that was the nightmare. Nick had tried to influence that force and managed to push it aside, figuratively. The malevolent force flowed from one direction to another, like a river, and Nick's Zephyx acted like a big pillar splitting its flow in two. Yet every moment he interfered with the flow, more Zephyx was required. But that was only a small price for what he was doing. Nick could isolate the nightmare's influence from somebody else. That might not be very useful, since people could just use a bit of Zephyx light to achieve the same effect, but it still represented a completely new way to interact with the darkness. With Nick's help, people could actually experience darkness without pain. After looking around for a bit, the woman noticed the hate-filled visages suddenly stopped avoiding her, and in an instant, she was drowned in them. She was startled but quickly recovered her wits and gritted her teeth. She knew a world of pain was awaiting her. And sure enough, it happened. A cut appeared on her waist, then another on one of her calves. 1 second of nothing. Another cut. She was in strong pain, but it wasn't as bad as expected. Beside her, Nick's eyes were shining. I can control it, Nick thought. I can control how the nightmare tortures her. At this moment, Nick could see what the woman saw. He could feel what she felt. Nick also felt the pain of the cuts, but he could deal with it without big issues. The important part was that Nick could give the nightmare directions. He couldn't perfectly tell it exactly what to do, but he could give it a general direction. It should focus on physical pain in the abdomen region and not go too hard immediately. It should focus on torturing illusions about loved ones with a theme of betrayal. It should inflict extreme fear by focusing on her personal fears and exploiting them. Nick very quickly realized how insanely useful this ability could be for information gathering. Chapter 603, Killed the Sun. Eventually, the woman could no longer stay in the dark and ran out of the chamber. The nightmare's influence vanished, and the technician told her the experiment was successful. Naturally, the bailiff was asked to keep what she'd seen a secret. While she left the room, Nick thought about the possibilities of his new ability. I could use this to get information out of people. I only need to lure them into the darkness. Nick looked at the door leading out. People would be shocked to know the nightmare technically isn't conscious. In fact, I don't even know if it's alive. Despite being the only human who had seen the nightmare, Nick still wasn't sure what it exactly was. The champion of light seemed to have come to a realization after Nick told him about it, but Nick still couldn't be completely sure. The only running theory he had was that the nightmare used to be human somehow. After all, the champion of light had said he knew now, after Nick stated the nightmare felt similar to him. Sadly, that didn't explain a lot. Was it dead? Was it alive? Had it truly been human before? Why was it no longer? Why was it in this isolated, dark location? Where did all this Zephyx come from? There were too many open questions. The only thing Nick knew was that the nightmare did not have a perception or a will. That was also the only reason someone as weak as Nick could control such a powerful force. But controlling something like this isn't easy either, Nick thought. I'm not sure if any human can control the nightmare's perception. Maybe some Specters can, but I don't think a human can. Although the chances that a Specter can actually control the nightmare are extremely low. Specters might be able to transport people to it, but they probably can't actively control it. The reason is that they're not on the same level as the nightmare and can't figure out how its influence and ability work. A Specter's core probably has the power to influence something like the nightmare, but without knowing how it works, the core can't be used to control it. Meanwhile, a Zephyx synchronizer copies a Specter, and since mine is partially attuned to the nightmare, it actually knows how the nightmare works somewhat. However, a Zephyx synchronizer isn't sophisticated or powerful enough to control something like the nightmare, despite knowing how it works. It simply lacks the power. Nick imagined his Zephyx synchronizer and his Specter core. I'm the only one who has both. I partially know how the nightmare works, and I also have a Specter core that lets me manipulate it. Nick looked at the lit part of the room again. With his new ability, he could also feel the nightmare's influence in the darkness. When it touched sunlight, it simply evaporated. It was like a spark falling into water. My ability also doesn't get deactivated by being under the nightmare's influence, since it doesn't really have a perception. Nick watched the sunlight burn away the nightmare's influence. However, the sun also doesn't deactivate my ability. Additionally, the way the sun interacts with the nightmare doesn't seem very deliberate. It just seems like two opposing forces attacking each other. Nick's brain started connecting clues. Does that mean the sun actually also doesn't have a perception? Silence. In fact, I can't remember a time the sun has ever deactivated my ability. If it perceived me, my ability would deactivate, but that never happened. So does it not perceive me? That was when Nick thought about the nightmare again. Technically, the nightmare can perceive me while I'm in darkness, but my ability still remains active because it doesn't consciously take note of my existence. It's like a person watching a wasteland and not noticing the stone-colored, camouflaged specter on the ground. Technically, the specter is in their field of vision, but they don't actively perceive it. However, the sun could see me easily. After all, when I'm outside, there's a direct line of sight between us, and its light shines right on me. I should be in its perception. But I'm not. Does that mean the sun's circumstances are similar to the nightmares? Is the sun actually not conscious? Is it dead? Like the nightmare? Nick's mind was going wild with possibilities. Yet the more he thought about it, the more confusing and unfitting everything felt. If the sun were truly dead, how could it have killed the Ancient Ones? Had it been alive back then? That didn't seem possible. But if it were dead, it wouldn't suddenly do something it wouldn't normally do. Being dead usually meant acting quite passively. Several more contradictions shot through Nick's mind. It seemed impossible the sun was dead, since many other things wouldn't make sense otherwise. Yet the way it behaved was very similar to the nightmare, and the nightmare was most likely dead. So, Nick turned left and saw the technician who had walked into the room. "How did it go?" he asked. Nick furrowed his brows and shook his head. He had lost his train of thought. I still don't know enough to reach a conclusion, Nick thought. It was pretty. Suddenly, Nick stopped talking. The technician raised an eyebrow, and Nick looked at him with furrowed brows. "Pretty what?" the technician asked. "Pretty good, pretty bad." "Pretty much as expected," Nick answered in a strange voice. The technician looked at him skeptically. "Why do I feel like I won't like what you're about to say, Nick?" he asked with suspicion. Nick looked at him for a bit longer. "I have a theory." "Okay, shoot," the technician said with apprehension. He didn't have a good feeling about this. "Theoretically, could the sun be dead? You know, like the nightmare?" Nick asked. The entire atmosphere in the room changed. The technician's eyebrows narrowed, and Nick felt all his casual humor vanish. The technician was dead serious now. "Nick, there are things I'm not allowed to ask you, but there are also things you're not allowed to ask me," he said seriously. "One of these is anything related to the Eternals. These are secrets no one outside the Shields is allowed to know. This concerns all of humanity. Knowing too much will put humanity at risk. Remember one thing, every era of human history ended when they were at their most advanced and strongest. Sometimes, knowing too much or being too strong will kill you. Do not look into these things. If you ever join our ranks, we will tell you more. Until then, do not look into the Eternals. This will put you, us, and all of humanity at risk." Silence. Nick had never heard the technician speak in such a serious voice. "And don't share any of your theories with others," he added after about 2 seconds of silence. At that moment, Nick's heart rate increased, and he could see the technician appeared even more serious after saying that. Not everyone would catch the hidden message, but Nick did. The technician had essentially told Nick he was on the right track but not allowed to ask any more questions. "So it's true the sun is dead," Nick thought. "Stop thinking about these things," the technician added. Then his serious demeanor instantly vanished, replaced by a charismatic smile. "Instead, tell me what exactly happened. How did your new ability work?" Nick took a deep breath and pushed all his thoughts about the sun to the back of his mind. "It went about as expected," he said before explaining to the technician how he could feel and manipulate the nightmare's influence. The technician seemed excited to hear that Nick had managed to shape it. Today, humanity had stepped closer to the Eternals. There was finally a human who could partially influence the nightmare, an Eternal. The two talked about how Nick's new ability worked for a while, before moving on to the next one. "Now there are only 2 left," the technician said. "Let's start with your mist form. After all, I can't help you with your main ability since I don't even know how it works or what it does. You'll have to fix that one on your own." Nick nodded. He didn't disagree. But if he were truthful, he should have. Nick had already fixed his main ability on his own. In fact, that had been one of his first projects. He simply progressed on it whenever the technician wasn't looking.